My name is Carla Sáenz, Regional Bioethics Advisor at PAHO. I want to welcome you all to our virtual seminar on ethics preparation for research in emergencies.
Antes de continuar, quiero dejarles saber cómo
But before we
acceder
continue, I
a
want to
la
let you know how we
interpretación
access the interpretation
de
on
esta
Zoom.
sesión. Esta sesión va a ser,
This
todos los que vamos
is
a hablar, vamos a
all of
hablar
us
en
are going to be
español.
speaking in
Sin
Spanish,
embargo, voy a
but
indicarle los
I
colegas
am
que
going
hablan
to
inglés cómo
let the
escuchar la sesión en
English-speaking
inglés.
delegates how they can hear us in English.
Dear colleagues, those of you that are that want to listen to this session in English, please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and you'll see a circle with 3 little dots that say more. Click on that and then you will find a little globe. And so if you go to that little globe, you can choose English and you listen to the entire session in English. So, ahora volvemos al español. Este
I'm now coming
seminario,
back into
como saben,
Spanish. As you know, this seminar is part of our series of seminars on topics related to clinical assays, which in turn makes part of the Clinical Assays Accelerator of PAHO. These are seminars co-organized by the Regional Bioethics Program in PAHO, which is also part of the Science and Knowledge for Impact of the Evidence and Intelligence Department for Action in Health. And it is also co-organized by our Quality and Regulation, Medication and Health Technology Regulation Unit, which is part of the Innovation, Access to Medications and Health Technologies in PAHO. Some of the topics to organize. Throughout the session, we will be receiving English that can be in English or Spanish or even Portuguese if you wish, or even French if you wish. But send them through the Q&A Zoom session and only use the chat for other comments or to maybe share other materials if you wish. So ask your questions on the Q&A section. I want to remind you that we are not giving a certificate for your attendance in this seminar. The seminar is being recorded, or I should be repeating, the session is being recorded and it will be distributed through the ethics list and will be available in the website of the Bioethics Regional Program as well as in the Clinical Assays portal of PAHO. And now, as I was saying, this seminar will be on ethics preparation for emergency research, but maybe we haven't actually given it the right name because we're not really only going to talk about ethics preparation. We're going to talk about regulatory preparation for research, specifically in clinical assays. If we speak of the regulatory component in public health emergencies. We're going to begin this session with a presentation by me on the ethics preparedness for research in emergency. And as I said, I'm going to be talking about the ethics aspects as well as the regulatory issues, but highlighting that these are different types of supervisions. The research supervision is different from the regulatory since it includes a subset of research. Both, and this is a key idea of the Clinical Assay Accelerator PAHO, both oversights in the region should be in keeping with the international relevant standards. So my presentation is now going to focus on ethics oversight, and my colleague Patricia Saidon will talk about the regulatory oversight in emergencies of clinical assays of new products that are trying to get new registrations for drugs or devices, highlighting that these are different types of oversights. They complement each other. We work in a growingly coordinated manner, but The
es
preparation
necesaria
for
para ambas
future
partes,
emergencies
para
is
ambas
necessary for
funciones de
both roles,
supervisión de la
for both
investigación.
oversights and research.
En lo que respecta a los
As
aspectos de
for
ética,
the
muchos
ethics
de ustedes
aspects,
estarán
many of you
familiarizados con
are
nuestra
probably familiar
publicación
with
Catalizar la
our
investigación ética
publication,
en emergencias,
Catalyze Research
orientación
in
ética,
Emergencies,
lecciones aprendidas de la
Ethics
pandemia de
Orientation, Lessons
COVID-19
Learned from the
y agenda
COVID-19
pendiente.
pandemic, and the pending agenda.
Esta publicación
This
no solamente
publication
cubre
not
aspectos
only covers
relacionados a
aspects
nuestra
related
preparación
to
para emergencias
our
futuras, sino
preparation
también
for
que
future emergencies, it
tiene
includes
recomendaciones que
also
son relevantes para
recommendations that are
fortalecer la
relevant
ética y la
to
investigación en general.
strengthen ethics in
Ciertamente
research in
durante la
general.
pandemia de
During the
COVID-19
pandemic, during the
aprendimos muchas
COVID-19 pandemic, of
cosas
course, we
sobre cómo
learned a lot of
mejorar
things
la
of how to
supervisión
improve
ética y estas
ethics
lecciones no
oversight.
debieran estar
And
circunscritas
these lessons should
solamente a
not be limited
emergencias,
exclusively
sino que
to
debiéramos
emergencies. We should
poner en práctica estas lecciones
implement
en
these
todo
lessons
momento y
at
para
all
toda
times and
investigación.
for all research.
Tenemos una serie, además de la
We have
orientación
also,
general,
aside from the
tenemos
general
un resumen
orientation, we
ejecutivo,
have an
luego
executive
tenemos
summary, and then
dos documentos breves
two very
enfocados,
brief documents
uno
that
en el
focus
papel de
one
las autoridades de
on the
salud,
role of
otro
health
en los comités de
authorities,
ética en la
another
investigación,
on the
y
ethics
no lo
committee.
resalto acá, pero si
And
van
I'm
a
not
la página
mentioning it
web de
here,
la
but if you go to the
publicación,
website of the
podrán ver
publication, you
también que
find
tenemos
also that
una
we
serie
include
de diapositivas que
series
ustedes
of slides that you
pueden
can
bajar por si ustedes
download
quisieran
in
presentar
case you
este
wish
contenido
to
a sus
show this
colegas, en sus
content
clases,
to your
a su
colleagues
comité de
or in your
ética u
classics or
otras
to your
partes
ethics committee
interesadas.
or whomever may be
Ahora,
interested.
el desafío central
Now, the key challenge
para hacer investigación ética en
for
emergencias es cómo
ethics
logramos
research
obtener
in
una
emergencies
revisión
is
ética que sea
how can we get an
rigurosa,
ethical
pero
review that's
eficiente,
rigorous but efficient,
rápida. En
rapid
situaciones de emergencia, por
in
supuesto,
cases of emergency, of course.
evidentemente quisiéramos que sea
And
también en no
of course, we'd
emergencia,
also
pero en
like to be able to
situaciones de
use it in
emergencia de
cases of
manera que nos
non-emergencies, but
permita
in emergency
iniciar la
situations so that we can
investigación
actually begin
rápidamente.
the research,
Quiero
the
resaltar
investigation
dónde
very
estamos
quickly.
ahora a
And I want to highlight
referencia
where we are now
de donde
compared to
estuvimos
where we were
durante la pandemia de
during the
COVID-19 e
COVID-19
incluso en el
pandemic,
momento que
even
publicamos
at the
esta
time we
orientación, que es del
published this
2022.
guideline, which was in 2022.
Y es que la región fue, yo creo que puedo decir
I
con
think I
confianza,
could
fue la
truly say
región
quite
del
comfortably that
mundo que
this
más
region was the region in the world that
rápidamente y más eficientemente tomó acción para
took
establecer
steps
normativas
rapidly and
específicas
efficiently to
para
establish
asegurar que
specific
se revisara la
standards to
investigación
make
de una
sure that
manera
the research
rápida,
was
rigurosa y
reviewed
apropiada en el
quickly,
contexto de
rigorously, and
COVID-19.
appropriately within the context
Sin
of
embargo,
COVID
ahora
19. However,
enfrentamos el
now
desafío
we're
de que
facing
esas
a
normativas
challenge.
específicas que
Those
eran
specific
para COVID
standards, which were for
se conviertan
COVID,
en normativas
must now
para
become
todas las emergencias
standards for
futuras.
all future
Y creo
emergencies.
que el
And I
brote de
believe that the
ébola que estamos viviendo ahora en el
Ebola
mundo, que es
outbreak
una
we're seeing
emergencia ya
today in
de
the world, which
impacto
is an
internacional,
emergency of an international
es el
impact,
recordatorio más
is
importante
probably the most important
sobre la
reminder to us
importancia de tomar
of the
acción
importance of
hoy
taking
para
steps
asegurar que
today
tenemos en
to
toda
make
la
sure
región
that
estas
we
normativas
have
apropiadas
these
para todas las
corresponding
emergencias
standards
futuras.
for all future
Y no solamente
emergencies.
que replicamos lo que hicimos
And
en
not only
COVID,
do we
sino
replicate
que
what we did
buscamos
in
aún
COVID,
mayores niveles de
we try to
eficiencia
find even
y
greater levels of efficiency
mayor
and
construcción sobre esas lecciones aprendidas de
build
la
upon
pandemia.
those lessons learned from COVID.
Quiero resaltar algo que
There's one thing I
quizás
want to bring up,
en su
which
momento fue
maybe
muy
at the time
obvio para
was quite
nosotros en la
obvious for
región de
us
las
in the
Américas,
region of the Americas,
pero, ah,
but
pero que quizás no fue tan obvio
maybe
para otras
not as
regiones del
obvious
mundo.
in other
Y es lo
regions
que
in the world,
llamamos
and
el
that is what we
abordaje de
call
dos
the
pasos que
two
propuso
steps
la
approach
OPS como
proposed
algo
by PAHO
específico,
as something specific,
bueno, que creo que pudimos proponer porque
which
teníamos,
I believe we
para
were
bien
able
o
to propose
para
because
mal, la situación de que
for
la
good or
emergencia
bad reasons, we
previa a COVID-19
felt that
había
the
sido Zika
emergency
y había
prior
sido en nuestra
to
región.
COVID had
Entonces
been
teníamos
Zika and had
un
been in
aprendizaje
our
reciente
region.
que
So we
quizás
had
otras regiones no tenían.
learning
Eso fue lo que nos
recently, which
permitió
maybe other
pensar en
regions
este
didn't have.
abordaje de
And that's
dos
probably what
pasos.
led us to think of this two-step
Un primer
approach.
paso,
The first step
el que haya una
was to
estrategia para
have
la revisión
a
ética a
strategy
nivel
for ethics
nacional o a
review at
nivel
a
de la
national
jurisdicción,
level
porque
or
si
at
es
the
una
level of the
provincia,
jurisdiction. It
estamos
could be a
hablando de un país
province if we're
federal,
talking
pero que
about a
haya una
federal
estrategia
company or
a
whatever,
nivel
but a
de la
strategy
jurisdicción entera.
within the
Y un
complete jurisdiction.
segundo
And then a
paso,
second
que
step,
para cualquiera fuera la
which
estrategia, haya
no matter what the strategy
procedimientos
was,
operativos
would
de los
be
comités que sean
operational procedures
rápidos
of the
y
committee
ágiles.
that are rapid,
Y si ustedes
agile.
recuerdan,
And if you
fue por
recall,
eso, porque son dos pasos,
these are
que
two
ya en
steps, and that's
marzo
why
del
in March of
2020, cuando
2020,
publicamos
when we published these documents. You're seeing the version of April there, but this was, or maybe it was April in 2020. But the first document was the first step, and the second document was the second step. These two steps have been fine-tuned with the help of all of you in this catalyzing the research in emergencies, and maybe better explained as different steps in the executive summary. Now, why do these two steps matter? Why didn't we do what was done worldwide and simply follow rapid procedures by a committee? Well, because we want to avoid multiple rapid reviews from different committees. Sometimes we seem to forget that committees don't operate on their own. Committees operate under the supervision of the national authority that ensures a complete overview of the national ethics system in research, ensuring that committees do the right job in keeping with the corresponding ethical standards. That's why this national authority has a role of thinking of a strategy that will ensure that not only do the committees review the do a rapid review, but that we not have too many of these rapid reviews with the same protocol, because that would prevent us from doing rapid reviews in cases of emergency. So the first step is the following. That is, that the authority supervising the ethics committees in research establish a strategy to avoid repetitions. Ideally, there should be only one single review or a coordinated review, ensuring that, and the authority not only must ensure that the strategy avoids repetitions, it must also allow for a rigorous review. And a different thing is the strategy that they have in Brazil, because that one might not work in Honduras. And that's why what we are suggesting is a series of different options, highlighting the urgency of coordination, not only amongst the different parts that could be playing different roles in that review, but also rigorous coordination with the national regulatory authority. There are a menu of options that can go from a committee or a single central committee, or maybe delegating to other committees certain research. There can be different options, different modalities, always with the idea of thinking, what is the best way to avoid repetition of these reviews in a given jurisdiction? And the second step, which applies for whatever strategy is chosen in the first step, is that the committee or the committees that must do these reviews establish these operational processes so that the review and the monitoring done of the research protocols are quick and in keeping with the needs and the emergency. And we publish in April of 2020 a model of these operating processes, which is updated in Annex 1 of the catalyzer. And what do these OPs say? What are the procedures of the REC? Well, we're talking about aspects that have to do with the organization of the REC or the ethics committee, so that they can do a rapid ethics review in an emergency, knowing that they have the necessary expertise to do in cases of emergencies, both internally as well as with the inclusion of outside professionals who can act as ad hoc reviewers of specific protocols. And there is organization with efficiency, with the secretariat prepared for the extraordinary demands of an emergency, appropriate mechanisms for rapid communication and coordination, and digital management of all the research process, and with the online resources in order to send the proposals in this way and have them
grupo de
filed and
trabajo sin la
done
presencialidad.
without
En
the
lo que
need for an
compete a los
in-person
procesos de
presentation.
revisión per
As for the
se,
review processes
estos
themselves,
van desde el envío
they go
digital, que es
from the
flexible
digital
también, considerando que hay
delivery,
aspectos que pueden no
but
ser
flexible because
centrales
we have to consider that there are
en un
certain central
protocolo y
aspects
uno
of a
tiene que
protocol,
flexibilizar
and we have
el
to be very
envío de estos
flexible when
documentos no
sending these
centrales para
documents
poder avanzar de la
in
manera
order
más
to be
ágil
able to
posible,
advance as fast as possible
teniendo reuniones
with
virtuales, priorizando
virtual
las
meetings and
propuestas que
giving
así lo
priority to
justifiquen,
proposals
y
that
todo con
justify
plazos
it,
muy
all
cortos,
with very
que son
short deadlines.
posibles porque
And they're
los
possible
procesos
because
para
the
emergencias, los
emergency
procedimientos contemplan
processes
un quórum
and the procedures
reducido
always
y
consider a
procesos
reduced
de revisión y decisión
quorum
diferida, no
with
todos en
deferred
simultáneo, sino que pueden
decisions and
recogerse las
revisions. They don't all have
posiciones
to be done
de manera
simultaneously. They can be
diacrónica.
collecting the
Y además un
uh,
monitoreo que puede
information
ser
diachronically.
diferido o remoto según fuera
And it can
necesario por
be
las
in a
características
deferred
de la
or remote
emergencia.
manner, depending on the characteristics of the
Hemos
emergency.
aprendido, sin embargo, en COVID,
However,
que
during COVID,
incluso
we
con una
learned that
estrategia
even
fantástica
with
y los
a
procedimientos
wonderful
más ágiles
strategy
posibles,
and the best,
el
fastest
trabajo
procedures,
es sumamente
the work is
demandante
very
para el
demanding
CIE.
for the
Muchos
RECs,
protocolos
for the
se
ethics
reciben,
committees.
hay que
Many of these
revisarlos
protocols
muy
are
rápidamente
received
y
and have
muchos
to
de
be
ellos a veces
reviewed very
están
quickly,
como
and many of them
decimos en Perú,
are,
muy
as we
crudos.
say in Peru, pretty
Entonces,
raw
no basta
or
con tener
green.
una
So it's not enough to
estrategia y
have the
procedimientos, sino que
strategy and the procedures.
debemos también
We
ver
must
cómo podemos
also
tomar acción
see
ahora para
how we can
evitar
take
estos
steps now
problemas
to avoid these
de la
problems
excesiva carga a los
of
comités de
an
ética
excessive
y
burden
los
on the ethics
protocolos que llegan
committees
muy
and
crudos.
protocols that come
Y
too
en ese
raw, too
sentido
green.
verán que las
And in that respect, you
recomendaciones
see
de
that the
caracterizar la
recommendations from
investigación
the
ética en emergencias
catalyzing
y el
the
trabajo
ethics
también que venimos
research in
haciendo
emergencies
van
and the work that we've been
buscando
doing is
abordar esos problemas.
seeking to deal with these
Necesitamos
problems.
algunos protocolos
We
maestros
need
iniciados de
some master
antemano, eso es algo
protocols
que
that
la
are ready in
región trató de
advance,
trabajar
something
durante
that the
Zika,
region tried to do
pero
during
no basta
Zika.
con
But
tenerlos
it's not
listos,
enough to have them
vamos a
ready.
tratar de
We have to
avanzar
try to
tanto
advance
como sea posible
as
en el
much as
proceso
possible
de
with the
preaprobación. Eso es algo
pre-approval
que
processes.
estamos
And this is something that
trabajando como
we're working
región
on
con la
as a
colaboración de
region
todos
with the help of
ustedes
all of you.
y aprovecho para, estamos temprano en el proceso,
And we're very
pero
early in the
aprovecho
process, but I
para
want to take
compartirles
advantage
el sitio
to
web que
share
hemos
with you
lanzado
the
con
website that we just
recientemente con
launched with the
información
recent
inicial sobre qué constituye un
information
protocolo
of what
preaprobado
is a pre-approved
y
protocol
cómo estamos
and
visualizando este proceso
how do we
para
visualize
que
this
en el
process
caso de una
so that
emergencia
in
hayamos
case of an
avanzado
emergency, we have
lo
already
más
taken
posible
as many steps
antes
as
de la
possible
emergencia.
before the
Eh,
emergency.
y creo que todos los que
And I
como
believe
yo
that those
han hecho
who, like
revisión ética
me,
en
have
emergencias,
done ethics
alguna
reviews
vez
in
nos hemos
emergencies,
jalado los pelos y hemos
we know
dicho, ¿por
we're
qué no
we're
avanzamos
pulling our
antes?
hairs and wonder why
Hemos
we're not
avanzado de
advancing.
pronto esto
Well,
antes.
because we should have done
Esto lo
this
hubiéramos
before.
podido ver con
We could have
antelación.
seen this in
Y claro, es
advance.
un
But of
trabajo
course, this
que
is
requiere
work that
mucha
requires a
coordinación,
lot of
un esfuerzo muy
coordination,
coordinado,
a
pero yo creo
tremendous
que así
coordinated
como
effort
hemos
on our
podido
part.
avanzar todo
So
lo que hemos
just as we've
podido
been able to
avanzar
advance
en el
as we
contexto de la
have
pandemia,
in the context of the
ahora,
pandemic,
antes de una
then
emergencia
now,
futura,
before a
vamos a
future
ser como
emergency,
región
we're going to be
capaces de
a
hacer
region
este
capable
avance
of
ahora. Y
advancing now.
quiero anticiparles que
And I want to let you
muy
know
pronto
that soon,
tendremos un
very, very
video
soon, we're going to have a
breve
video, a
explicando
brief
este
video
proyecto de los
explaining
protocolos
the
preaprobados.
project of these pre-approved
Hay otros
protocols.
desafíos que
There
escapan a
are
lo que he
other
mencionado, por
challenges which are not
supuesto,
part of what I've
eh,
already mentioned, of course.
y están
And
abordados, no los vamos a tocar en
there,
detalle,
we're
pero
not going
quiero
to go into
mencionarlos,
details
están
with them, but I
abordados
do want to
también en el
mention them. They're
catalizador
also
de
mentioned in
investigación
the
ética en
research
emergencias. Hemos
catalyzer,
abordado muchos desafíos
and
relacionados a
we've
la
dealt with many
desconfianza
challenges related
en
to
la
distrust
investigación, en las
in
autoridades
research, in the
sanitarias,
national
en los
authorities,
profesionales de
in the
salud.
health professionals.
Estos están en el capítulo
They
2 de la
are in
orientación
chapter 2
y
of the guideline.
verán que en respuesta a
And you'll
ello, desde
see
entonces hemos
that
trabajado
in
mucho
response to that, we have been working
alentando la
to
transparencia de la
encourage
investigación y esto ha incluido,
transparency
por
during the
ejemplo,
research.
aclarar
And
cuál es la
that
importancia
includes
de la plataforma
clarifying the
internacional de
importance of the
registro de ensayos
international
clínicos
platform for
ICRP y de
clinical
que todos los
essay
países contribuyan
registration, the ICRP,
con
so that all the countries will
alimentando esta
contribute by
plataforma para que haya una
feeding into
claridad
this so that
sobre
there's
todas las
there's
investigaciones que se
clear
realizan a
indication
nivel
of
mundial,
all
pero
research is
también al
done
interior de un
worldwide as
país.
well as within a given country.
Hemos tenido
We've
dificultades
had
durante
difficulties
la
during
pandemia
the
con el
pandemic
monitoreo ético
with
porque
the
se
ethics
producía
monitoring
mucha
because
evidencia
a lot of the
muy
evidence
rápidamente que
was being
podría
translated very
comprometer la
quickly,
aceptabilidad
and it
ética de un
could commit
protocolo
the
incluso. Hemos
ethical
trabajado en la
acceptance of a
publicación
protocol. We've
preguntas para
worked with
guiar
the
el análisis
publication of
ético de la
questions to
investigación
guide
con
the
seres
ethical
humanos,
analysis
que tiene un
with research with
aspecto no
human beings,
solamente de
which
la
not
revisión
only includes a review
inicial,
of the
la revisión
initial
ética inicial de un protocolo de
ethical review of
investigación,
a
sino
research
del
protocol,
monitoreo de
but
las
the
investigaciones
monitoring
incluso,
of
con
the
la esperanza de que un
research
mejor monitoreo
in course,
en
with the
general
hope
nos
that
ayude a un
the
mejor
monitoring will
monitoreo en
help us
situaciones de
improve
emergencia.
in cases of
Y
emergency.
un desafío
And
adicional
an
central
additional
para nuestra
key
región
challenge for our
es
region is
importantísimo en el contexto de COVID,
very
fue el
important
uso
during
no
COVID was
ético
the
de
non-ethical
intervenciones que
use
no
of
habían sido probadas y que se ofrecían a
interventions that
la
had not been
población
approved and were being
fuera de una
offered to the
investigación. Esto está abordado en
population
el capítulo
outside of the
5,
research.
que
This is dealt
construye
with
sobre
in
una
Chapter
publicación
5, which
previa
speaks of a
de
prior
mayo del
publication from May
2020 de
of
la OPS,
2020
que
from
ha sido
PAHO,
también
which was
como orientación que ha
also
sido adoptada en
used
una
or
publicación
adopted
posterior
in
de la
a
OMS
later
del
publication of the WHO in
2022.
2022.
Y me refiero con esto al
And
marco MEURI.
I'm
Voy a
talking
decir
about
muy
the
rápidamente
MEURI
algo sobre el marco MEURI.
framework,
Es
and I'm
algo que
talking to you
se
briefly about
concibió
this MEURI
internacionalmente
monitor
en
framework,
el marco
which
de
was within the
la
framework
primera
of the
emergencia
first
mundial de impacto
world
internacional por el ébola del 2014.
emergency of international impact of
Y
Ebola in
quiero
2014.
resaltar que el uso
And I'd like
en
to mention that
situaciones de
the use
emergencia
in
de
emergencies
intervenciones que no han
of
sido probadas y
unapproved
que se ofrece a la
interventions
población fuera de una
offered to the
investigación
population
es
outside of the
estrictamente
research is
excepcional.
strictly
Entonces,
exceptional.
la autoridad sanitaria
Think
está
that
ahí para
the
asegurar que a la
national
gente no se le
authority is there
den
to
cosas
make
que no
sure
han
that the
sido
people don't
probadas.
receive things that
Y
they
si
have
se
not
está
that have not
usando
been
una
approved,
intervención no probada, que
and that
sea
if
en
they're
el
being
marco de una
used in those cases,
investigación
that it be done
para
within the
poder
framework of an
aprender y
investigation
para
so that
poder
we can
asegurar las
learn and
salvaguardas que
ensure the
todos
safeguards
sabemos que
we
son
all
parte de hacer una
know are
investigación de
part
manera
of
ética.
an ethical
Sin
research.
embargo, de manera
However,
estrictamente excepcional,
as a strictly
puede
exceptional
ser,
circumstance,
énfasis en
it could
puede
it
ser
could be
éticamente
possible
aceptable
that
en
it would be
situaciones de
ethically
emergencia
acceptable in cases of
dar a la
emergency to
población
give the
una
population
intervención que no ha
an
sido probada y
intervention
que no es posible
not yet
ofrecer de una
approved,
manera,
but
por lo
which
menos inicialmente en el
at
marco de
least
una
initially
investigación.
has not been part of an investigation
Reitero,
process.
siempre es
And I
mejor hacer
reiterate,
ensayos
it's
clínicos
always
que
better to
permiten
do the clinical
responder la
assay
pregunta
to
científica mucho
respond
más
to the
rápido
scientific
y saber
questions much
mucho más
faster
rápidamente si
and
algo
know much
funciona
quicker
o
whether
no.
something works or not.
El, sabemos
We know
y con datos abrumadores de
with
la pandemia de COVID
overwhelming data
que
from
muchas veces
COVID
intervenciones en las que
that
hemos gastado
often many of the
mucho
interventions in which we
esfuerzo y
made an
muchos
enormous
recursos
effort and
resultan
we
no ser
spent a lot of
seguras o no ser
resources turn
eficaces
out not to be very
y
effective
que
or
demora
safe. And
muchísimo construir
it
la
takes a
evidencia
long time
necesaria
to
con el
get the
marco
necessary
MEURI
evidence with a
cuando
memory
con
framework when with
menos
less
de
than
100, menos de un centésimo de las personas que
a
recibieron, por
tenth of the
ejemplo,
people who received
plasma convaleciente en el
the
contexto
convalescent
COVID
plasma,
fueron
for example,
necesarias
during
en
the
el marco de un ensayo
COVID,
clínico
was
para
necessary
saber que
to
esta
know that
intervención no era
this
eficaz
intervention
para la
was really not
COVID-19.
effective for COVID-19.
Usar el marco
To
MEURI
use the MERI
es algo
framework
para lo que
is
tenemos que
something
tener muchísima
we have to
cautela
be very
porque puede
cautious with
dificultar
because
hacer
it can
ensayos
make
clínicos
it difficult to do
aleatorizados y
clinical
son esos
unauthorized
ensayos
clinical
clínicos
assays.
los
And
que
it's
nos van a
these
dar la
clinical assays that are
respuesta
going to
a las
actually give us the
interrogantes
true response to the
que tenemos,
questions
que nos
that
van
we
a
have
permitir saber si
and
algo
are really going
funciona
to
o no
let us know
funciona.
whether things work or don't.
Ahora, si bien es algo
Now, if
estrictamente
it's
excepcional,
strictly
el
exceptional,
uso del marco MEURI,
the use of the
eso no quita
Mary
que no
framework
debemos estar
doesn't mean
preparados.
that we should not be
Debemos
prepared.
estar
We
preparados para
must be
usar el marco
prepared to
MEURI,
use the
incluso si
Mary
se trata de
framework,
algo
even when we're
estrictamente
talking about something
excepcional.
strictly
Y
exceptional.
quiero
And
mencionar que en el
I also want to
contexto
mention that
del
in the
brote reciente de
context of the
hantavirus
recent
tenemos una experiencia
outbreak of
exitosa en la
hantavirus,
región
we
del
have a
uso
successful experience
eh,
in the
eh,
region of the use
del
of
marco
the
MEURI
Muri framework
que ha sido publicada
published
recientemente
recently
por colegas
by
de la región,
some
colegas de
colleagues in the
Argentina.
region
El
from
responsable de la
Argentina
publicación es
who were
Fernando
responsible for the
Tortosa.
publication. It was Fernando
Em,
Tortosa, in fact.
pero
But
cuando no se usa el
when
marco
we don't
MEURI de
use
manera
the Muri
correcta, cuando
framework
se da
correctly,
intervenciones no
when
probadas fuera de una
unproved
investigación
interventions
sin
are
seguir los
offered without
criterios
the research,
éticos,
without
se daña mucho
following
la
the ethical
confianza
criteria,
en las
the
autoridades
trust in the
y los
authorities
profesionales de
can
salud.
be lost, and in the health
¿Cuáles son
authorities.
estos criterios
So what are
éticos?
these ethical
No vamos a
criteria?
ahondar en esto,
I'm
pero
not
los
going to
quiero
go into
mencionar
any of
muy
the details. I just
rápidamente.
want to mention
La
them very quickly.
justificación, la
Justification,
supervisión ética
ethical
y
oversight, and
regulatoria, el
regulatory
proceso de
oversight,
consentimiento
the
informado
informed
y la
consent process,
contribución a la
and the
generación de evidencia.
evidence generation contribution. The first ethical concept is that, is there reason for us to find this product outside the research within an emergency? And the next three ethical criteria are, how should we proceed? If we have the justification, how should we do it? And I invite you all to review that content in chapter 5 of the
en el capítulo 5 del catalizar la investigación ética en
catalyzing research ethical research in emergencies. And I want to mention that as part of the different motors of our clinical assay accelerator, facilitating the research in emergencies is one of our priorities, as you can see in our portal of clinical assays of the Americas. And I'll end by listing some pending tasks at different levels for our ethical preparedness in emergencies. At a regional level, and I'm talking about us, PAHO, we have to guide or think of pre-approval, regulatory and ethical processes of the research protocol, pre-approval and final approval. This is work that we're doing with the national authorities, with the regulatory authority forum. We must take the steps to continue to take steps to facilitate multi-country assays and regional cooperation, and hopefully the publication of the regional model for clinical assays will be useful for this. We have other actions that will soon release. And another important thing that I'm sure you'll recall, we've already mentioned, are agreements between the different institutions, so that it's the ethics committee in research in ethics is the one that does the oversight of the work of another institution. This is something that we're still working on. It's still pretty raw. At a sub-regional level, I want to invite you all, particularly those of you who come from the smaller countries, to think of a possible strategy for ethics oversight, which could be extraterritorial. For example, think of the Caribbean countries. There's so many small countries there. Maybe the strategy for an ethical review, a rapid and rigorous and appropriate monitoring should not be done necessarily national, but maybe sub-regional, maybe within the Caribbean, or maybe within the English-speaking countries of the Caribbean. And then at a national level, the authorities, or the pending task, is to establish, fine-tune, adjust the national strategies to avoid repetitive reviews. And at the level of the ethics committees,
adoptar los POEs para las emergencias
to establish processes for emergencies, having established the jurisdiction. Annex 1 of this, we hope, will be useful to you. All the publications I've shared with you are available in the Bioethics Regional Program website. And before I end my presentation, let me show you this QR code, which includes our list of research ethics. And now I will invite my colleague, Patricia Saidon, who will now present on regulatory matters, which, well, let me say, you already know Dr. Saidon. She's an expert and consultant of the Quality and Regulation Unit for Medications, Technologies, and in Health. She has also coordinated more work in this area. So over to you, Patricia. Thank you very much, Carla. It is a pleasure to be here with you, and I will be talking about the regulatory tasks that we have to accomplish in case of emergencies.
Ay, perdón que algo pasó aquí. ¿Se ve bien la
Okay.
presentación?
Yes,
Muy
can
bien.
you see?
Ah,
Yes,
Me
good.
parece la parte de abajo, pero creo que le agrandaste un poquito mucho, pero ahí va. Ahí
I
va,
think
perfecto.
it's
No, no,
okay.
está
Maybe it's a
perfecto.
little
bueno.
large. No, I think it's
Entonces,
fine.
vamos a hablar
All right,
entonces de
so
los
we're going to
aspectos
talk about
que tiene como desafío una autoridad
the
regulatoria
challenges
nacional de
that a
medicamentos
national
en
regulatory authority
la
or
fiscalización de
NRA
los ensayos
has
clínicos
to
durante las emergencias
have
sanitarias. Y
oversight
vamos a tocar estos 5
of
aspectos,
technologies and
es decir,
medicines
los
during
principios claves
an
que hay que
emergency.
tener
We
y
need to
después las
have
tareas en la
key
evaluación de los
principles, then
estudios, en el
there should be
seguimiento, en la
assessment, follow-up,
verificación y en el análisis
verification,
de resultados.
and
Y voy a
analysis
empezar
of the
entonces ahora
results.
con los
And let me then
principios
start
claves,
with key
teniendo en cuenta
principles,
que las emergencias de
considering
salud pública
that
son un verdadero
public
desafío
health
para
emergencies are
la
a true
integridad y calidad de los
challenge
ensayos
for
clínicos, porque
integrity and continuity
generalmente se
of
hacen en
clinical
condiciones
trials, because
cambiantes, con
usually
limitaciones
are
operativas,
carried out in
y
changing
esos
situations.
ensayos clínicos en
And those
situaciones de
clinical trials,
emergencia
when there is an
deben ser
emergency,
ensayos en donde
should
se
be
garantice, como en
trials
todos los
where
ensayos, la seguridad, los derechos y
there's
el
a
bienestar
guarantee
de los
of
participantes
safety,
y que
rights of the
generen una
participants
evidencia
and
robusta
well-being
y
as well, and
confiable
they should
porque van a dar
generate
lugar a decisiones
a
regulatorias.
robust
En
and
este
reliable
sentido,
evidence because
retomo lo
they
que
will
decía
lead to
Carla, es muy
regulatory
importante
decisions.
tener
And
en
as Carla
cuenta
was saying,
entonces
it's
que
very
las
important
autoridades
to bear in
regulatorias
mind
tienen que
that
tener
the
en cuenta este
NRAs
aspecto de
must
que la
take this
generación de
into account,
evidencia que
that
surge de
generating
esos ensayos
evidence
clínicos
from
debe ser una
clinical
evidencia
trials should
robusta
be
y
a
confiable
robust
para esa
and
decisión
reliable
regulatoria.
evidence. I
Y
repeat this.
esto implica que
This is
cualquier
essential, and
decisión
therefore,
relativa a la
any decision
continuación, a la
related to
modificación, a la
continuation,
suspensión del ensayo
modification, or
debe basarse en
suspension
una
of
evaluación
the
cuidadosa que
trial
deben hacer esas
must be based
autoridades
on the
en términos
careful
de el perfil
assessment
de
of
beneficio-riesgo
the
para
NRA in
los estudios
terms of
clínicos
the
y técnicos.
critical to
Un
quality
principio
factors.
rector, entonces,
So, a
es
ruling
que estos
principle is
estudios en
that these
emergencia deben
studies
lograr un
during
equilibrio
emergencies should
entre
have
la
a
protección de los
balance between
participantes,
protecting the
la validez
participants,
científica de
the
los datos que
scientific
se
validity
obtienen
of
y
the
la
data
flexibilidad
obtained, as well
operativa
as the
necesaria que
operational
debemos
flexibility
tener para
necessary
adaptarnos a estas
to
situaciones
adapt
extraordinarias.
ourselves to
Y
extraordinary
es
conditions
muy
and
útil entonces
situations.
que las
And therefore, it is
autoridades
very useful
regulatorias
that
entiendan
the
que todo
NRAs
su enfoque
understand
debe
that
estar
their
basado
whole
en la
approach should be
gestión del
based
riesgo y la
on
proporcionalidad,
managing
es decir,
risks and
que
on
las
proportionality.
medidas
In
y
other
requisitos
words,
se
that
deben
measures and
ajustar al
requirements
nivel
should
de
be
riesgo
adjusted
de
to
los
the
ensayos
level of
sin perder
risk
de vista el
of the
cumplimiento
trials
de los
without losing sight
principios
of
esenciales de la
complying
buena
with the
práctica
essential
clínica.
principles of
Eso presupone que
GCP or good
hay que
clinical
identificar
practices. Therefore,
cuáles
we
son
need
los
to
factores
identify
críticos
what the
para la
critical
calidad de
factors
esos
are
ensayos durante
for
la
the quality
emergencia
of
y cuál va a ser
those
entonces el control de
factors.
esos
So,
factores.
in other words, again, the
Otro
critical to
punto
quality factors.
importantísimo
Another
es que
significant
la
point
autoridad
is that
tiene que poseer
the
normas
NRA
y
must
procedimientos que
have
permitan
standards
entonces
and procedures
rápidamente
that
durante las
allow
emergencias
them in a
adoptar
quick
mecanismos
way
regulatorios
to
flexibles.
adopt
Algunos los
flexible
nombró Carla,
regulatory
por
mechanisms.
ejemplo,
Carla
los
mentioned some of them,
protocolos
for
preaprobados.
example,
No es que en ese
pre-approved
momento, si no
protocols.
tienen normas
So if they don't have a
anteriores que
standard or
permitan en
prior
ese momento
standards that allow
adaptar
them to
regulatoriamente
make
estas medidas,
adaptations
lo
from
van
the
a poder
regulatory
hacer, porque en ese
standpoint,
momento
they will be able to do
rápidamente
it because very
tienen que
quickly
tomar
at that
medidas.
point they will
Entonces
be
es bueno que
able
la
to
autoridad
take
en
certain
estos
measures.
tiempos
So the
en donde no
NRA
hay
at these
emergencias
moments when
pueda
there are
redactar
no
normas, pueda
emergencies, or at
redactar
the moments when there are
procedimientos
no
en
emergencies,
torno
they
a
should have procedures according to different measures that they could use pre-approved protocols and meetings to stipulate certain matters and ways in which they can continue forward. And of course, there should be standards on how the NRA will act in an emergency, always making sure that the clinical trials be well designed, and this is a lesson learned, avoiding to have evidence which is generated, evidence of poor quality during the emergency. This should be avoided at all costs. And there should be collaboration, reliance, and optimizing resources in order to generate a robust evidence within a short period of time, especially given that many of the trials need to be amended constantly. And so you need to have to make decisions very quickly regarding amendments and changes and modifications. So all these decision making by other authorities, if they can be made through reliance, they will help to the regulatory process. And therefore, we have two working groups in the Forum for Clinical Trials. In addition to pre-approved protocols mentioned by Carla, we also have the oversight of clinical trials during emergencies, and also reliance regarding oversight of clinical trials, so that we can have a standard harmonizing document for the whole region that will help generate standards and procedures by the NRAs. Another major point is to carefully evaluate operational adaptations which can be implemented during an emergency, for example, decentralization of activities, or also remote revisions and oversight, as well as prospective planning to anticipate possible scenarios through developing contingency plans, identifying critical processes for the trial, and establishing strategies for risk mitigation. Finally, all studies, as always, they need to be transparent. Traceability needs to be guaranteed, and everything needs to be documented according to the decisions and changes implemented during the emergency. Now, let me talk about evaluation. The first point is that the protocol should be designed to answer a relevant question in the context of the emergency. It should be based on non-clinical history or antecedents, or also, clinical if they have them, and not clinical if not. Also, it should have an adequate sample size, and also it should have a design, as I already said, that can be adapted, and it should allow for the generation of robust and reliable evidence for regulatory decisions. So, what kind of measures can we take? So, in addition to having meetings to discuss different aspects, in addition to pre-approved protocols, in addition to using reliance, there should also be a criteria, knowing to learn how to choose criteria according to the needs of the protocol. And so there should be generation of terms for the amendments that need to be made for the protocol, because sometimes data says that, oh, you have to change this or that very quickly regarding the protocol. They are based on the data that were obtained. And we also need to take into account that some simplification can be carried out. The regulatory files can be streamlined. Some of our RNAs don't have extraordinary resources, so you have to reassign resources, reprioritize, and also send resources where they are needed. And we also need to take into account the possibility of having regulatory and operational adaptations of the trial, prioritizing evaluation, and finally strengthening the coordination and joint evaluation. Regarding follow-up, the protocol should have all critical elements to evaluate safety. You should demand that the sponsor monitor safety on a continuous basis, obtaining data on real time regarding safety, and generate amendments when there are relevant changes, because the continuity of the trial will depend on whether the participants can continue safely and if risks are being managed and under control. So safety is a continuous process, and regulatory decisions related to the continuation, modification, or interruption of the trial are based on dynamic integration of available evidence. This is why we need to have evidence available quickly, and we should be continually in communication with the other parties. Also, we should have alternative procedures such as remote informed consent, remote monitoring, and centralized monitoring, remote inspections, direct sending of the product or output of the research to the patient, also decentralized centers, and managing the research products or outputs, which sometimes can be sent in a decentralized way, in other words, not to the research center, and therefore we could have decentralized centers. And this means that we will be also working on oversight of the decentralized centers, and also remote visits, not in person. In other words, all of these things need to be borne in mind by the NRAs for their normative framework. So you have to define all of this in the protocol, especially when you're going to have remote activities or decentralized places. But the central area is still responsible. So you should have all kinds of procedures, and you maintain the responsibility of the principal investigator. Some tasks will be delegated, of course, with local physicians, but there should be oversight. So the whole process is more complex. So now let's go to verification. There are electronic media to do all these remote inspections. We need to have a phase of impact and feasibility. I need to have a preparation phase as for any other situation, this to guarantee good clinical practices. Of course, we need to bear in mind that there are many aspects that are linked, both for the impact and feasibility phase as well as for the preparation phase. And then there will be the performance of the remote inspection itself, carrying it out, doing all these remote inspections for good clinical practices. We will also need to maintain the regular scheme, but we need to be able to see many documents digitally, which are available now digitally, but when we go on personal inspections, we can see them directly. And so then finally, we have to have an inspection report. There should always be a risk-based approach, and you should always assess the impact of doing these remote inspections. We need to be aware that these remote inspections can have limitations, and we should to approach the limitations when we do our operational procedures and again apply risk-based approach. And finally, we need to make sure that we are able to interpret the results, and I'll repeat this several times, because for the next phase, the analysis of results, we need to make sure that they are robust and useful studies for decision making. The sponsor has to have procedures and other ways to analyze results if there have been interruptions, changes in visit schedules, people who have been lost to follow up, etc. And also the endpoints, finally, and the variables should be amenable to interpretation. And in conclusion, so the conclusions are that the trials should be able to be initiated, adapted, and to continue during emergencies, maintaining methodological consistency and quality of the data. Supervision and oversight should be centered on the modifications, the trials, and the impact on results as well. And oversight should maintain standards. It should have standards and procedures, but it should also be flexible so that it can be adapted to situations that would be ever increasing. And thank you very much for your attention.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank you.
Patricia.
Thank you so much, Patricia.
Es un gusto ahora
It
para
is
mí
a
dar,
pleasure
dar
now
la
to
bienvenida a la
give
primera persona que nos acompañará como
a
parte,
hearty welcome to the first person who will be with us in this panel. And let me tell you why we have set up this panel. Our region learned a great deal during COVID-19, but also we see in an ongoing working with the NRAs and the RECs, that there is a lot of turnover, and we many times don't have the opportunity to learn from those people who were there during COVID, who were doing all these things and doing them quickly. So the first person who will be talking during the panel is Leandro Cornejo Amoretti. Leandro is with us today because he was a member of the transitory committee for supervision of clinical trial for COVID-19. And this was committee in Peru. It was an ad hoc committee established for ethical review of COVID-19 protocols. Leandro is also a teacher of law and bioethics at the University of San Marcos and the Catholic University of Peru. And thank you for being with us, Leandro, and sharing your views. Thank you very much for your presentations, and thanks to the Regional Bioethics program and the unit on regulation of medicines and technologies, health technologies. Let me share with you some experiences from my experiences. I made part of this ad hoc committee for COVID-19 created in Peru. I was the technical secretary of this committee. And regarding the recommendations that PAHO developed to strengthen research in situations of an emergency, I think one of the main lessons learned from the pandemic is the dependency on the national regulatory authorities. They are working on changing conditions, something that has already been mentioned here. One first lesson specific, and I have 5 of them. And the first one is the importance to having clear delimitation of competencies between the NRAs, the RECs. Ethical protection of participants does not improve if you have an overlap of functions or if you assign responsibilities to agencies that were not created for that. This is important for accountability, which occurs always after an emergency. Everyone becomes a general after the war, as people say. The second lesson is to need to strengthen operational features. PAHO talks about the importance of have support mechanisms for emergency situations and structural things in place. You need to do quick assessments and a quick response. So you should guarantee to have enough support personnel and of course, depending on the circumstances, the duration of COVID-19 in Peru, it lasted for about 3 years in legal terms. It was a long duration pandemic. This put this on a high relief and as a highlight. During emergencies, things should be distributed among many, not to lose data, etc. Also, technical secretariats and authorities and ethics committees are essential. This is the third lesson. We require more intensive work by these groups. In many countries, such as in Peru, the main responsibilities fall on authorities that continue to do their same work as usual, whatever it may be. For example, through reducing the workload for technical secretariats, this allows them to devote a lot of their time to working on the ad hoc committee, and this would be helpful. Fourthly, and continuing with the prior idea, it is important to consider to include more personnel, more members to be part of the committee, and especially when the work of ethics monitoring and review has to be done quickly. So if we have many people who are specialized in ethics, then we will have more people that can work on this. Also, we need to learn more about ethical application during an emergency. When we have more people available, deliberations can be more efficacious and fruitful because we will have more people available. And finally, my fifth lesson, this may sound strange a little bit, but I think it is important to have capacities and tools for dealing with the public. A health emergency may become a public problem, and the media will be involved, the public will be involved. Some clinical trials during the COVID-19 emergency became very visible for the public, and sometimes they became just like huge things. So it's important to have spaces that can be used with a double function, one, accountability, and also an opportunity to teach the public. In Peru, my country, research ethics is not very well known, and it is not easy for people to identify the different agents and stakeholders. For example, if you have someone, a communicator who's a member of the ethics committee, be in charge of social media, this can go a long way to establishing a bridge with the citizenship, with the public, and therefore the dialogue can be generated with the public. Since a pandemic is a huge public problem requiring so many things at once, then that would be a clear lesson. And so these were the 5 lessons that I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Leandro, for your reflection. I think what you told us about how demanding the ethics reviews were really highlights the urgency of pre-approving protocols, because this will allow us to advance as much as possible and then relieve and release the other people who are doing other things, multiple jobs. And so if we have these experts as part of the committee to work on these things, this will also work toward transparency and accountability. Now I would like to call on Carlos Berger. He will give us a different view. Carlos Berger is now with us, representing the national authority supervising the CEIs, or sorry, the RECs, the Research Ethics Committees, and they lead and have oversight of the RECs. And Carlos Berger works in the health ministry in the province of Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires is a federal country, and so the provincial level is where these things are handled. Carlos went through this during the pandemic, so it is a privilege to have him with us. So over to you, Carlos.
Thank you so much, Carla, and thank you all very much for being here. And as Carla was saying, it's not a national organization, it's a provincial one I belong, which is the Central Ethics Committee of the Health Ministry of the Province of Buenos Aires. And the value of our institution is that it's been the first ministry in Argentina accrediting the Ethics Committee. So in this very brief presentation, I'm going to suggest 3 fundamental axes. First, why is it important to have oversight of the work of ethics committees by an accrediting entity and the way in which it's done, as well as what is the inheritance, what is the legacy of the pandemic. And we have to understand that the oversight of an ethics committee for an agency that accredits is mandatory. It is definitely mandatory because when one grants accreditation to a committee, one not only verifies that it is in a position to comply with its work, it must keep that accreditation.
implica una labor
And that
continua de
requires
comunicación
continuous
con los comités
communication work with
acreditados
the
y en el
accredited
caso de
committees.
Argentina
And in the case of
particularmente,
Argentina in
desde
particular,
que la última modificación en la
since the
norma
last
NEMAT ha
modification,
descansado ampliamente
it has
en la
rested mainly
confiabilidad que
on the
tiene un sistema de
reliability
acreditación.
of an
Por tal
accreditation
motivo,
system.
acreditar un
So
comité
to
y
accredit a
supervisar el comité
committee and
es una obligación de
oversee
un
it
ente
is the
acreditante o de un
obligation
comité
of an
central
accrediting or
fundamental,
a
porque no
central
nos basta con
entity
acreditar a un
as
comité,
something
sino queremos
key. It's not
establecer un
enough to
régimen
accredit it. We have
confiable
to have a
para la comunidad
reliable
de
system for
investigación,
the
para los
research
pacientes, para
community,
los
for the patients,
investigadores,
for the
para los
researchers,
centros de
for
investigación.
the
Uno de
research
los avances
centers.
que
One
nosotros hemos
of
tenido en
the
este sentido,
advances we've had in
en
this respect,
consonancia con los
in
documentos
keeping with
OPS, es
the
lograr una
PAHO
acreditación
documents, is to
diferenciada de
have
comités que en
differentiated
cierta manera nos
accreditation of
permitió, como
committees, which
decía
in a
recién
way, as
Leandro,
Leandro was
identificar
saying,
aquellas
allowed us to identify
fortalezas
the
y
strengths
aquellos
and
recursos que había que
resources that
acrecentar
had
en
to
comités
be
que iban a evaluar
increased
ensayos
in
clínicos, lo
committees
cual
that were going to
obviamente
assess
esto
these clinical
genera
assays,
una
which obviously
consecuencia en una
generates a result
situación de emergencia
of
sanitaria.
in
Segundo
an
punto
emergency, in a health
tratar,
emergency. The
¿cómo se
second
va
thing to deal with
realizando
is
este
how is
tipo
this
de
going to be
supervisión
done?
en un comité de
How are
ética,
we
al
going to
menos desde
supervise
nuestra
or
experiencia desde
oversee
el
the
nivel
ethics committee
central?
from the
Uno es
central
al
level
momento de la
as we've done?
acreditación,
Well,
que
first at the moment
simplemente
of the
podríamos
accreditation,
decir
where one
que es
could
una
simply
etapa
say that it
previa
is
en
a
la cual
prior
uno
stage where
verifica
one
que el comité se
checks to
encuentra
make sure that the
conformado de
committee
acuerdo a
is
estándares
set up
internacionales,
with
como así también que
international
sus
standards
POEs
and
se
that the
encuentran adecuados a
POs, the
los
OPs
estándares
are in keeping with
internacionales. Esto
international standards.
incluye, por
It
ejemplo,
includes, for example,
disposiciones específicas para evaluar
specific
estudios,
provisions to
ensayos clínicos que no se le
evaluate
van a
studies or
exigir
clinical
a los
assays that
comités que no
are
evalúan
not going
este
to be
tipo de
required from committees
investigaciones,
that do
¿verdad?
not
Dentro de
check that
eso,
type. And
exigimos
in that, we
la existencia
insist
de los
on
POEs
having
en
these
emergencia
OPs
sanitaria
in
que
health
hemos adoptado
emergencies, which we've
obligatoriamente la propuesta
adopted
que hizo la
with
Organización Panamericana de
the
la Salud, con
proposal made
realmente
by the Pan
muy
American
buenos
Health Organization
resultados
with
en el
very good
ámbito de
results
la acreditación
in
provincial.
the provincial
Dentro
accreditation.
del segundo
And
paso,
in that
digamos,
second step
de
of
lo que
the
es la supervisión, sería el
oversight
seguimiento de las tareas, ¿no es cierto?
would
Una
be the
vez
type of
acreditado,
task. So
¿cómo
once it's
realizamos ese
accredited,
seguimiento?
how do we do the
En base a
follow-up?
esto, nosotros
And
hemos
based on that,
establecido un
we have
programa de
established a
fortalecimiento en
strengthening
lo que es
program
el funcionamiento y
for
control de los
the
comités de
actual
ética que se basa en tres
operation
ejes
and supervision
fundamentales.
based on
Uno
three
tiene que ver
fundamental axes. One
con
having to
verificar
do with
aspectos formales
checking the formal
referidos a la
aspects that refer
documentación
to
que
the
aplica hoy en día el
documentation that
comité,
is
que
applied
debe
by
ser
the committee today,
específicamente aquella que
which must
esté
be specifically the
registrada
one that
ante
is
el ente
recorded
acreditante,
before
que en
the
este caso es el
accrediting
Comité de
entity,
Ética
which in this
Central,
case
por
is the
ejemplo,
Central
no
Ethics
aplicar
Committee, for
procedimientos
example, and not to
operativos que no
apply
han sido
operational
aprobados
procedures
por
that
el
have
nivel
not been
central,
approved
porque
by the central
justamente
level,
el
because
tener
having
procedimientos operativos
these
estandarizados,
operational
registrados
procedures
en
that
el
are
nivel central,
standardized and
da una
registered at the central
garantía
level
a la comunidad de
ensures
investigación que se
that
cumple con determinados pasos
the
que
certain
más
steps
de
required
una
are
vez se
being
han
complied
mencionado
with.
en este
And it's
encuentro,
been mentioned
vinculados a la
frequently here that are
celeridad, a
related to
los tiempos que
speed,
deben ser
to the
respetados,
times,
a la
the
calidad
deadlines,
de
the
la
quality
evaluación
of
y
the
por otro lado
evaluation,
también
and
a lo
also
que es la garantía hacia
the
los participantes de la
insurance
investigación.
for those participants of the research.
El segundo
The
punto a evaluar
second
para nosotros
thing
como
to
comité de
consider
ética
as an
ya
ethics
es
committee
qué
is
criterios
then
tuvo ese
what
comité para evaluar.
criteria did
Y
they have to
entonces buscamos como
evaluate?
marco de
And then we
referencia
use as a
los
framework
fundamentos que tuvo el
the
comité para
basis
la
that the committee
evaluación de un
used to
estudio,
evaluate the
tomando
study,
como
taking
referencia
as a
las
reference
pautaciones.
the
Para esto
guidelines.
nosotros
And for
individualizamos
this,
cuáles de
we
estas pautas
individualize
serían
what are the
susceptibles de
guidelines and
monitoreo
which
de
could be
parte de un nivel
susceptible to
central,
the
de tal
central
manera que uno
monitoring
puede
so that one
identificar
can
que ese es el
actually
estándar
identify
común.
that
Porque
that's the
estamos en
common
ética,
standard because we're
razón
in
por la cual,
ethics.
como es
And
una
since
disciplina
it
que
is
trabaja sobre la
a discipline
argumentación,
that works
las
based on
argumentaciones pueden ser múltiples,
arguments
pero
or
partimos de un
allegations,
consenso
and this
obligatorio
could
para
be
los
many,
comités,
but we
que
have
es
to consider one
justamente
element which
tomar
is
como
very
marco de
important to the committee,
referencia
which
a
is
las
that
pautaciones,
the
a diferencia de lo que pasa
guidelines
con la
have to be used as
supervisión
a
que
reference,
hace
aside
una
from the
autoridad
actual oversight,
regulatoria
which
con
is
los
done by
centros
the
de
regulatory
investigación,
authority
donde
with
realiza
the research centers, where
inspecciones
they
que están
actually do
relacionados
certain
a la buena
inspections which are
práctica y
related
por
to
otro
good
lado al marco
practices
regulatorio
and the regulatory
vinculado
framework, which is
a
linked
la actividad.
to the actual activity.
Obviamente, esto
Now,
nos genera a
obviously,
nosotros
this
un panorama de la
leads to
situación de
a
cómo
whole
se encuentra
overview of the
trabajando el
situation
sistema de
of
comités
how the
acreditados,
accredited committees
generándonos a
are working
nosotros
and
como
generates
documentación
as
interna lo que
internal
llamamos un
documentation what we
scoring.
call
Un scoring
the
de
scoring,
cumplimiento
the
con pautas
compliance
que son de
scoring
público
with
conocimiento
guidelines
para los
which are publicly known. And this compliance scoring helps us identify in a health emergency, which has to give priority to the efficient equipment with the possibility to resolve, what would be the
estarían desarrollando
possible
proyectos de
nodes that
investigación
would
en
be carrying out
consonancia
research
con un
projects in
acuerdo
keeping with
con la
an
autoridad
agreement
regulatoria
with
local. ¿Qué
the
quiere decir esto?
NRA.
Esto implica
So what this
una
means is
comunicación
that we have to have
constante de parte
constant
del Comité de
communication
Ética
from the
Central
Ethics
con la
Committee,
autoridad
the
regulatoria
Central Ethics
local
Committee,
para
with the local
identificar
NRA,
de parte
so
de la
that one
autoridad
can actually
regulatoria
identify
centros más investigadores y de parte del
the
Comité de
research
Ética Central
centers and
cuáles son los
on the part
comités
of the Central Committee,
fortalecidos
which
que
are
darían
the
una
strengthened
correcta
committees that would
respuesta,
actually give
llamando
the correct
correcto a
response. And
aquello
when
que
I say
sea
correct, I mean
eficiente, con
efficiency
garantías
with
y principios
guarantee
éticos
of
respetados
bioethics
para
issues
afrontar esta
to
emergencia.
deal with the
Bien,
emergency.
si no hacemos este
So if we
trabajo
don't
de
do this
supervisión de los
work
comités de
of the
ética, la
oversight of
información
ethics
se
committees, the
pierde
information is
y no
lost.
vamos a poder dar
And we won't be
cierta
able to
prioridad
give the
a
necessary
destacar a aquellos
priority
equipos que
to
realmente
those
tienen capacidad de
equipment
trabajo y
or
que pueden
teams that
responder a
actually
la
have the
necesidad de la
possibility of
emergencia.
responding to
Sino
the
de lo
emergency
contrario,
and
como bien
having the
se
working
contó, o
capacity.
se charló en este
And as
encuentro,
was
muchas
mentioned,
veces algunos
often,
comités por
if
falta de
this doesn't
experiencia
happen, the
terminan
committees without experience
aplicando
may end up
mismos criterios
applying the same
procedimentales
procedural
para una
criteria
situación de emergencia
to
que cuando no la
emergency
hay. Y
situations
esto evidentemente da cuenta
as they do
de
to
una
a situation
ineficiencia
without an
del
emergency,
sistema en
showing
el
the
cual quienes
inefficiency of the
estamos en
system,
el rol
where
central
those of us who are
debemos
in the
tratar
central
de
role must
controlar
try
y
to
debemos
control
tratar de
and
mitigar.
try
Este
to
scoring
mitigate.
obviamente
This
podríamos
scoring, of
llamarlo
course,
de
could be
eficiencia, no sé si decir
efficiency.
eficiencia, en
I don't
todo
know if it's
caso,
actually efficiency. I think that
de cumplir
it's more
con
of
su rol como
compliance
comité
with the role
acreditado es
as an
interno del
accredited
nivel
committee,
central. Esto es
and
decir,
it's
que el
accredited
comité
by the central
no
committee. So
tiene un
that means that the
scoring,
committee doesn't
puntaje por el
have
cual
a
puede competir en ser
scoring
el
that
mejor
can allow
comité
it to
de la
compete to see
región,
which is
sino
the best
justamente nos
committee of
sirve a
the region.
nosotros
No, it
como un
simply
dato de
helps us
referencia para
as a
saber
reference
cuáles
to
son aquellos
know
que están
which
mejor
of those that
preparados
are better
para
prepared
afrontar una
to
evaluación en
deal
situaciones
with
de emergencia
an
que iría de la
emergency
mano de
situation,
los mejores centros
going
y de los mejores
hand in hand with the
investigadores
best
para poder
centers and the
generar
best
esta
researchers to
evidencia.
generate the
Tercer
necessary
punto que
evidence.
tenía para
And the third
comentarles
thing I
es
wanted to talk
justamente lo que
about
nos
is
comentaba Carla
what
con relación al
Carla was
COVID.
mentioning
Si bien
regarding
no
COVID.
teníamos todo esto
Though
tan
we didn't
trabajado en
have
un
this
programa de
so detailed
fortalecimiento,
in a
como yo les
strengthening
expliqué,
program as I
tuvimos
just
que
explained,
empezar a armar
we had to
algún
begin to
tipo
set
de
up some
evaluación
type of
conjunta para
joint
superar
evaluation
determinados
to overcome
obstáculos. En ese
the
momento todavía
obstacles.
no se había
Right now,
trabajado
at the time, we hadn't yet
lo que son
worked
los procedimientos
with the
operativos
operational
en situaciones de
procedures
emergencia, que hoy es
in emergencies,
obligatorio
which
para
today
un
is
comité que va a
mandatory for any
evaluar
committee
ensayos
that's going to
clínicos,
assess clinical
razón por la
assays.
cual
And
empezamos a trabajar
hence,
en
we
estrategias de
began to work with
individualizar cuáles son los
strategies
protocolos que se encontraban en la
individualizing the
jurisdicción,
protocols
qué
that were
centros
in
los
the jurisdiction
poseían,
and what centers
cuáles eran
had
los
them,
comités,
what
para poder
committees
realizar
were
una
there,
evaluación
so that we could
conjunta y
do joint
coordinada
and
desde el
coordinated
nivel
evaluation
central
at a
junto con
central
los
level
comités
together with the
institucionales. De esta
institution
manera
committees.
nosotros podíamos
In that way,
superar
we were able to
el
overcome
requisito normativo
the,
existente en Argentina,
the
por el cual
regulatory
cada centro de
request that
investigación
existed
tiene
in
que tener
Argentina,
su
where
propio
each
comité de
research
ética y
center had to have
evaluarlo.
its own
Entonces
ethics committee
dijimos,
and had to
para evitar
evaluate.
esta
So
múltiple
we said to
evaluación, como
avoid this
decía Carla,
multiple evaluations, Carla
juntemos
was
o
saying, let's
reunámonos
get
con todos los
all
comités que
together with the
tienen en
different
su
committees
tarea evaluar un
capable of
mismo estudio
evaluating
y
a single
lleguemos a
study, and
criterios
let's
uniformes,
establish
cada uno
uniform
respetando
criteria,
y aceptando,
respecting
obviamente,
and
que vamos a hacer
accepting,
una
obviously, that
evaluación
there's going to
consensuada,
be uh,
respetando,
an
obviamente,
evaluation by
lo que
consensus,
se
and we will
concluya
be
en este grupo
respecting
de
the
trabajo
conclusions in
conjunto.
that
Después,
joint
cada
working group.
comité,
And then each committee
obviamente,
can
emitía
obviously
su dictamen
issue its
aprobatorio de
own
acuerdo con
approval
los
based
requisitos
on
formales de
the
la propia
formal
institución
requirements of the
y, en
institution
definitiva, con lo que
and
marca el marco
what's
regulatorio en
established by the
Argentina y, en
National
particular, en la
Regulatory
provincia de
Authority of
Buenos
Argentina
Aires.
and the province
También ha
of
sucedido en
Buenos
esta
Aires.
jurisdicción
In that
muchos casos,
jurisdiction,
como
we also
decía
had
Carla,
many
de
cases, as Carla
intentos de
mentioned, of
implementar,
attempts to
de imponer
implement or
determinados tratamientos en la
impose
emergencia
certain
que no habían
treatment
pasado
in
por
emergencies that had not
marcos
actually
de
gone
proyectos
through
de
the
investigación.
research
Hemos
projects.
afrontado también
We
la
also
evaluación
found
de usos
evaluations of
compasivos que pretendieron después
compassion use,
querer
which
tener el
then
suficiente diseño
tried
o
to
podríamos
or
llamarlo
say that they
disfrazarlo
had
como un proyecto
the
de investigación para
project
generar
of
evidencia, lo cual sabemos que
mask
es
it as a research
perfectamente
project, well,
equivocado,
which we know
que no
was
tenía ningún tipo
exactly the
de
wrong thing. And there
validez
was
desde
no
lo
true
metodológico
validity,
ni valor comunitario.
methodologically
Y esto
speaking,
obviamente
or
fue una
community
duda que
value.
tuvieron que
And
afrontar
that was one
muchos
of the doubts that
comités
many of the
y que
committees
se ha
had to deal
podido
with.
trabajar desde el
And we have been
central.
able to work
Lo mismo con
with
relación
this
a
at
los
a
marcos
central level.
MEURI.
And the same with the Muri
Rol del
framework.
comité
The
central fue
role of a central
justamente
committee
poder
was precisely
individualizar
to be able to
estas
individualize
posibles
these possible
destacando
evaluations of the
desde
NURI
ya
framework,
el rol de que no se
highlighting the
trata de una
role
investigación,
of
que es una
the
aplicación de
research,
emergencia
saying that it was a
excepcional y que esto
situation of an
genera también el
emergency and an
compromiso
exceptional
de poder,
situation,
de
which
tener que
meant
investigar
also
a
that we had
futuro
to
para que realmente se tenga
investigate in the future
evidencia.
so that we had the
Con
necessary
esto, para
evidence, even though it
terminar,
was in the future. And to
lo que uno
end,
pretende
what
en un nivel
we
central
at
es
a central
mejorar
level
la tarea de
expect to
los comités,
improve
no
the
pasar a
role
ser un
of the
rol
committees and not to
supervisor
become
de
an
inspector,
oversight,
fiscalizador y
inspecting,
sancionador, por más que la
sanctioning
ley nos
committee,
habilita
even
esta
though that's what we're
reacreditación de
allowed to
comités.
do.
Lo que uno
We're
desea
supposed to
es que
accredit
el
these
sistema
committees,
de
but what we
comités
want is that
acreditados
the
mantenga un
accredited
estándar
committee system
que
keeps the right
de lo que
standard
implica estar acreditado. ¿Se entiende?
and what
No
it
es
means to be
solamente un
accredited. It's
certificado,
not
no es
just a
solamente una
certificate, it's not just
constancia, pero por
a
sobre todas
document.
las
It
cosas,
is, above
la
all things,
supervisión tiene también un
um,
rol formativo, un
a
rol
training
educativo a
role,
los
an
comités
educational
y
role for the
también es
committees,
una manera
as
de dar
well as a
confiabilidad al
way
sistema
to
de evaluación e
give the
investigación. Si no, de lo
research
contrario, la
evaluation
misma
systems the
comunidad, los
necessary
mismos investigadores
reliability.
pueden
The
pensar, bueno,
researchers
el comité
themselves
está
otherwise could
acreditado,
think, oh, well,
evalúa y
the
aprueba
committee's
lo que
accredited, it
venga,
evaluates
cuando en
and approves
realidad
what it
nadie
wants,
se encarga de
when the fact
unificar criterios ni
nobody
de
is
tareas de calidad
unifying
formativa. Creo que en el
efforts. And I
fondo
think that
lo que
that's
todos
important. And I
queremos
think that
es,
in the end,
más allá de las
what we all
cuestiones
want not only
regulatorias,
is not
más
only
allá
the
de lo que impone la
regulatory
ley,
issue or what's
queremos
established by law.
concientizar a la
We want to
comunidad
make the community
de
aware,
investigadores en
the
general,
research
que la
community
dimensión
in general,
ética, que el rol
that
del
the
comité de
ethics
ética
committee and the
no es
role
un
of an ethics
impedimento,
committee
es una
is not
herramienta de
an
trabajo
obstacle.
y
It's
como
a
herramienta de
working tool,
trabajo
and as
debe
such,
tener la
must
suficiente
have
fuerza como
the
para crear
necessary strength to
conciencia en la
create an
comunidad de
awareness amongst
investigadores
the research
que no es
community
posible investigar sin plantearse
without
previamente
being able
la
to
dimensión ética y
investigate if we don't
telemática
consider
del
the ethics
proyecto, sea
element of
del
the
nivel
project,
de riesgo que sea. Bueno,
whatever the level of
hasta
risk
ahí mi
it is.
aporte.
So I'll
Muchas
end here.
gracias.
Thank you very much.
Muchísimas
Thank you so
gracias
much,
a Carlos
Carlos.
y gracias por
And thank
resaltar
you for
ese rol
highlighting
del
the
Sistema Nacional de
role
Ética de
of
la
the National
Investigación, que es
Research
un
Ethics
aspecto
Committee
fundamental de
system,
la
which
visión
is
de la
fundamental
OPS
in
para
PAHO's
el
view
trabajo en ética de la
for the work
investigación.
in
Creo que si
research
no
ethics.
trabajamos
I
todas
think
las
that if we don't
partes
all work with
interesadas, todas las
all those
partes
interested
involucradas de una
parties and
manera
all those
coordinada,
involved in a
no
coordinated
vamos a
way,
lograr que la
we're not
investigación
going to
se haga de
make the
manera ética,
research
no vamos a
become
lograr
something
promover la
ethical,
investigación
nor are we going to
bien
promote
hecha, que es la
research
investigación que
well
lleva
done.
a
And that's
encontrar
the one that takes us to
soluciones para la
find
salud y el bienestar de las
solutions for health
personas.
and welfare.
Es un gusto ahora, quedándonos
And
en
now it's a
Argentina,
pleasure.
tener
We're
con
still in
nosotros a Laura
Argentina to have Laura
Traversi.
Traversi.
Laura Traversi nos
Laura
acompaña
Traversi is
desde
with us
ANMAT, que
from
es la
AMAT,
Autoridad
which
Regulatoria
is the
Nacional de
National
Argentina, donde ella es
Regulatory Authority in
responsable de
Argentina.
los ensayos
She is
clínicos.
responsible for clinical
ANMAT, como
assays
ustedes
there.
saben,
AMAT,
es
as you
una
know,
autoridad
is
regulatoria
a
nacional de
national
referencia
regulatory
en nuestra
reference
región
authority in the
y ha
region
tenido
and has
una
had
experiencia muy importante
this
en el
very
contexto de la
important experience
COVID-19. Y bueno,
during
para nosotros es un
COVID-19.
gusto contar
So it's a real
con
pleasure to
Laura y que
have
nos
Laura with us here
comparta su
today and hear
reflexión,
her
sus
comments
experiencias y
and
los
her
desafíos que
experiences
ella
and the
plantea.
challenges that she's
Gracias, Laura, por
seen.
estar
Thank you,
con
Laura, for
nosotros.
being with us.
Hola, buenas tardes a
Hello, good
todos,
afternoon
buenos
to
días,
all of
buenas
you.
tardes a todos.
Good day,
Gracias,
good afternoon,
Carla.
and thank you, Carla.
Gracias a todos también por la
And thank you all for
invitación
this
a
invitation
participar en este
to
panel de esta
participate in
temática
this
que es
panel
tan
on this
interesante.
very interesting topic.
Y bueno, desde mi
And of course,
visión como
from my
representante
point of
del
view as a
Departamento de
representative
Ensayos
of the
Clínicos de ANMAT,
Clinical Assay
les voy
Department
a
of
comentar
AMAT,
un poco la
I want to
experiencia
tell
que
you
tuvimos
briefly of
desde
our
ANMAT como
experience in
agencia
AMAT as a
regulatoria en el
regulatory
proceso de
agency in
evaluación de
the
ensayos de farmacología
evaluation
clínica
process of
durante la
clinical
pandemia
pharmacology processes
COVID-19
during
y luego
COVID-19.
algunas cuestiones
And then
relacionadas
some
a
aspects related to
oportunidades de mejoras o
improvement
reflexiones
opportunities
de
or
lecciones aprendidas durante
thoughts
la pandemia.
regarding lessons learned
En
during the
principio,
pandemic.
todos sabemos que
In
la
principle, we all
pandemia
know that the
COVID-19
pandemic, the
exigió para todos
COVID-19,
los
was
actores
demanding for
respuestas
all
rápidas,
actors. They
la necesidad
required
de
rapid
adaptación
response, a
para
need for
ser capaces
adaptation,
de plantear
so that one would be
medidas con la
capable of setting
celeridad que la
measures at
emergencia
the
sanitaria lo
speed the health
requería.
emergency required.
Entonces, en ese contexto,
So,
nosotros
in
desde
that
ANMAT nos
context, in
encontrábamos
AMAT,
con dos escenarios.
we
Por un lado
met up with
estaban
two
los ensayos
situations.
clínicos que
First, the
estaban en
clinical assays that
curso,
were
que estaban
in
reclutando
progress,
participantes o con
that were
pacientes
recruiting
en
participants and
tratamiento y en
patients that were
seguimiento y que
under
no había que
treatment and being
descuidar.
followed up, which we
Y
could
por
not
otro lado,
neglect.
los
And
ensayos
on the other
clínicos que
hand, the
se
clinical
iban a
assays that were going to
presentar, ya
come
fuera
up
para COVID o para otras
either for COVID or
patologías.
any other
Entonces, en ese
pathologies. So
contexto,
in that
se
context,
pensó con la
we
rapidez que lo
sought
requirió
as
la
fast as we
emergencia,
needed
la
for the
creación, la
emergency to set up and publish in the ATLAT webpage a document that was entitled measures and recommendations for clinical pharmacology assays during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Y ese documento
And the
tenía como
document,
objetivos, bueno,
the purpose of this
obviamente
document
disminuir
actually was,
el
of course,
riesgo
to
de
reduce
diseminación
the risk
viral
of viral
y de
dissemination
saturación del sistema
and
de salud
saturation
que
of the
en
health
ese
system,
contexto
which
podía recibir
could
mayor demanda.
be
Y por
more
supuesto
demanding at
proteger
that
los
point. And
ensayos que
also, of
estaban en
course, protect
curso
the
y
assays that were
pensar
in
en las
progress
mejores
and think of
estrategias
the best
a aplicar o
strategies
implementar para los
applying and
estudios que
applied and
se fueran a
implemented to the studies that
presentar
were going to
para
be
evaluación.
presented.
Ese documento tuvo distintos
So
pilares.
that
Uno
document
de
had
ellos
different
fue
pillars,
la
one of which was
mitigación de riesgos
the risk
en ese
mitigation
momento para los
at
estudios
the
en
time
curso y
for
para
the
los estudios que se
studies
iban
in
a
progress and the studies
presentarse,
that were going to
exigió
come
a los
up,
patrocinadores de los
demanding
ensayos
from the
clínicos que
sponsors
presentaran
of these
planes de
clinical essays the
mitigación de
presentation of
riesgo
risk
y
management
que esos
plans,
planes fueran
plans that had
notificados
to
a
be
todo lo que es el
reported to
ecosistema de
all
investigación
the
clínica, a
clinical
los centros de
essay
investigación, a
ecosystems, the
los
research
investigadores, a
centers,
los
the
comités de
researchers, the
ética
ethics committees,
y por supuesto,
and
bueno,
of
a la
course,
agencia
the
regulatoria.
regulatory authority.
Nosotros evaluamos más de
We
200
evaluated
planes
more
de
than
mitigación de
200
riesgo y el
risk mitigation
contenido
plans, and the
incluía, entre
content
otros
included,
temas,
amongst other things,
aspectos relacionados al proceso de toma
aspects
de
related to
consentimiento
the
informado, a las
informed consent
visitas y a los
process, the
procedimientos que se
visits, the
iban a llevar a
procedures that
cabo en
were
los
going to be
ensayos
taking place
clínicos,
during the clinical
a todo lo que
assays,
tenía que ver con el
and all
envío
aspects
y
related to the
dispensación del
uh,
producto en investigación
sending
y a
and
los monitoreos de los
presentation
estudios.
of these and the monitoring of
Luego
the studies.
también otro
And then, of
pilar que
course, another
tenía este
pillar that the
documento
document
es
had
todo lo que tenía que ver con una
was
gestión
all aspects related
adaptativa
to the
acorde a la pandemia.
adaptation aspects to the
Respecto al
pandemic.
reclutamiento,
The
se
recruiting,
cerró el reclutamiento para
we
voluntarios para
closed
estudios para
for
voluntarios
volunteers,
sanos,
for
pero como
healthy
excepción
volunteers,
se
but
dejó
as an
abierto el
exception, we left the
reclutamiento
recruiting
para
open
estudios
for
para COVID-19, o sea,
studies
que
for
fueran destinados,
COVID-19
voluntarios sanos que fueran
of
destinados
healthy volunteers
a
that were
prevención de
going for
COVID-19.
prevention of
Y en
COVID-19.
relación al
And as
reclutamiento de
for
pacientes,
recruitment
o sea,
of
en los estudios
patients,
clínicos destinados a
clinical studies
patologías,
for
se dejó abierto al
pathologies, we
criterio de
left
los
it open to
patrocinadores, los
the
investigadores,
criteria of
los
the
comités de
sponsors, the
ética, de
researchers, the
acuerdo
ethics
a la
committees,
situación
depending on
sanitaria
the
de,
health
digamos, de cada
situation
jurisdicción.
of each
Todos saben que
jurisdiction.
Argentina es un
We
país
all know that
extenso,
Argentina is a very large
un país
country.
federal, como
It's a
bien
federal country,
mencionó
as
Carlos.
Carlos
Entonces,
mentioned.
de acuerdo
So,
a la situación que estuviera
based on the
transitando
situation,
cada región y a
each
su vez al
region,
tipo de estudio,
and
a los
depending on the type of
centros, a
study
la
or the
situación
centers and the
propia de cada
situation of each
centro,
center,
a la complejidad de los estudios,
and the
como mencioné
complexity of the studies,
anteriormente,
as I mentioned before,
analizar
all of these
si el
aspects had to take into
reclutamiento de
consideration
los
whether the
estudios en
recruiting of
pacientes
these patients
continuaba abierto
would
o si se
continue to
suspendía.
remain open or
En la
whether
mayoría
it
de
was
los casos
suspended. In
se
most of the cases, it
suspendieron
was suspended
transitoriamente hasta que
temporarily
mejorara la
until
situación
the
sanitaria.
health situation
Y
improved.
otro de los aspectos fundamentales
And
fue la
another fundamental aspect was
descentralización.
the
O sea, pasamos de un
decentralization.
modelo
We
de
had a
estudios en
model
los que el
of
participante
studies where the
iba
participant
principalmente al
would
centro
go to the
a un
center
modelo en
directly
el cual
and went to
el
a
estudio fue
model
hacia
where
el
the study went to
participante.
the
Entonces
participant,
se permitió el uso de
and it allowed for the
telemedicina,
use
la
of
realización de
telemedicine,
visitas a
uh,
domicilio, de
home visits,
procedimientos también a
and
domicilio,
procedures at
entrega de
home as
productos de
well,
investigación a
the delivery of the
domicilio, y
product
todo
at
esto se
home
tenía
as
que
well.
ejecutar
All this had
a
to be
través de
done
procedimientos
through
operativos estándares
standard
establecidos,
operational procedures that
documentados
were already
y
documented
bajo
and
buenas
clearly
prácticas clínicas.
standardized and
Y otro de
under
los
good
pilares
clinical
fundamentales
practices.
de este
Another fundamental
documento
pillar
tenía
of
que
the
ver con la
document was
evaluación de
the
los
actual
estudios, si se iban a
evaluation of the
implementar
study,
una
and
evaluación acelerada
an
de los
accelerated
estudios.
evaluation of the
Entonces,
study
ANMAT
was going to be
estableció
implemented. ANMAT then
como
established
prioridad
as
los
a
ensayos
priority
clínicos destinados a
the
tratar, a
clinical assays
prevenir
to
la
treat and
enfermedad de
prevent
COVID-19.
COVID-19,
Para ello,
for
con
which,
cada presentación
with
formal del
each formal
ensayo
presentation
clínico,
of the
se
clinical
debía dar
assay,
aviso a ANMAT
warning had to be given to ANMAT
de que se había presentado el
of
estudio y
the
los datos del
presentation of the
estudio a
study,
un correo
the
electrónico
data of the study,
institucional, para
through
nosotros
an
poder darle
institutional
prioridad
email address
ante
so
el
that we
proceso de
could give
evaluación.
the evaluation process the
Y para que la
priority it
evaluación
required.
también fuera
For
más
the
ágil,
evaluation to be
existe en
faster,
ANMAT y
in
existía en ese
ANMAT at the
momento
time
una
we had and still
regulación
have
que
a
permite
regulation
la
that would
realización
allow
de
us
reuniones
to have
previas a la presentación
meetings
formal
prior
del
to the
ensayo
formal presentation of the
clínico.
clinical assay.
Estas reuniones, por
These
supuesto que en
meetings, of
pandemia se
course,
hicieron
during the
de manera
pandemic were
virtual
done
antes se
virtually
hacían
before
presenciales.
they were
Hoy
in
ya
person.
quedaron
Today,
virtuales
now we continue to
ya
do them
establecidas de esta
virtually.
manera para
And
poder llevar a cabo esa
in this way, we
reunión.
are
El
able to
patrocinador de los
carry
estudios
out this,
debía
and the
mandar
sponsor
toda la
of the study
información
had to send all the
relacionada al
information related
estudio,
to the study,
protocolo,
the
monografía del
protocols,
producto de la
the
investigación,
monographies of of the research product, so
hiciéramos
that
una
in ADMAT we were able to
preliminar
review
y luego en la reunión
this
se
in a
pudiera hacer
preliminary
por
manner and then
intercambio
have
entre patrocinadores
during the meeting, an exchange between the sponsor, the regulators,
se
ALMAT,
pudiera,
and
digamos, ya anticipar
anticipate
observaciones o
any
requisitos
possible
locales
comments or local requirements
que
that could
fueran
come
a
up
ser necesarios
that
para la
may
aplicación del
be
estudio
necessary for
posteriormente.
approval of the study.
Entonces, bueno, esto
So,
también de alguna
in a
manera
way,
acortaba tiempos de
this also
evaluación.
shortened
Estas
the
reuniones, por
evaluation
supuesto, se hacían
times.
con un
The
criterio
meetings were
basado en
done
riesgo.
with a
Quiere
risk
decir, para estudios que pudieran
criteria in mind,
presentar
studies that could
alguna
present
complejidad, ya sea en su
complexities
evaluación,
either of the
en su
evaluation,
supervisión o en su
the
ejecución.
supervision, or the
Entonces,
execution,
o algunas cuestiones operativas
or
también podían
maybe
ser
even some
complejas. Por
operational
ejemplo,
aspects that could be
en
complex,
Argentina no
like
teníamos
in
experiencia
Argentina,
de
for example,
ensayos
we didn't have
clínicos
experience with
en
clinical
los que se
assays
reclutaran
where
más de
one would
5.000
recruit more than
participantes, como
5,000
ocurrió, por
participants,
ejemplo, con algunos
as
estudios de
actually
vacunas.
happened with some of
Entonces,
the
bueno, por
vaccine studies.
supuesto,
So
acá se agregaba
we added
complejidad
the
operativa también.
operational complexity
Con
here.
respecto a la
As for
evaluación,
the
o sea, cuando
evaluation,
los patrocinadores
when the
presentaban formalmente el
sponsors
ensayo
formally
clínico
presented the
para
clinical essay
evaluación,
for its
además de
evaluation,
esto que nosotros
aside
yo había
from what
mencionado anteriormente,
I
de
just
pedir un
mentioned before of
aviso
requiring
previo,
a prior
digamos, dieran aviso de que se había presentado un
notification
ensayo clínico para
of the
COVID,
clinical essay
se
being
cambió, se
presented for
modificó el
COVID,
proceso
this
de evaluación.
evaluation process was
Nosotros
amended,
habitualmente
it
y
was modified.
tradicionalmente
Traditionally,
hacemos un proceso de
we
evaluación
have a
secuencial. ¿Esto qué quiere
sequential
decir?
evaluation
Que
process, which means
se
that
va a evaluar el
we
ensayo
evaluate
clínico,
the clinical
aquellas
assay
técnicas que intervienen
and
en la
the
evaluación de
techniques
ensayos
used
clínicos
in
lo
the
hacen
evaluation
secuencialmente,
in a
una después de
sequential
la
manner,
otra.
one after the other.
Para los estudios de
But
COVID se
for the
hizo algo más
COVID-19 studies, we did
coordinado, se
something in a
hizo
more
algo en
coordinated fashion.
simultáneo.
We did it
Nosotros
simultaneously.
recibíamos el
We
aviso
would
del ingreso
receive the
del estudio para
notification of the
evaluar
study for
y desde
evaluation,
coordinación
and
dábamos aviso a todas las
from
áreas
my
técnicas que
level,
intervienen en lo que es la
we
evaluación del
announced
ensayo
this to
clínico
all
para que
those
se
technical
hiciera una
entities that
evaluación
had
en
to participate
simultáneo
so that
y
it
que
would all
las
be done
observaciones también
simultaneously. And
se
the
emitieran, en caso
observations
de
would
haber
also be
observaciones,
issued,
de
if there
manera
were any
simultánea
observations,
y
would be issued
coordinada
also in a
para
simultaneous
poder
and
acortar
coordinated manner
tiempos
so that
de
we could shorten
evaluación.
the evaluation times.
Esto, por supuesto,
Of
exigió
course,
un esfuerzo
this
superior,
required
una
a
coordinación
greater effort,
institucional muy
very
importante,
careful
pero
institutional
permitió de
coordination,
alguna
but
manera también
in a way, it also
tiempos
helped
récord
us
de evaluación que la
reach
verdad que
record
agilizó
evaluations
muchísimo
times. It
y esto
sped it up
permitía,
incredibly.
digamos,
And in this
mantener
way,
los
we were able
estándares
to
de calidad,
maintain the quality
los estándares
standards
que se
and
exigen para
the
lo que es la
standards required
evaluación de un
for
ensayo
evaluation
clínico.
of a clinical essay.
Entonces, lo que cambiamos
And
fue más que nada
what
los
we actually
procesos,
changed
no
were
los
simply the
estándares
processes, not the
que nosotros, por
standards
supuesto,
that
exigimos.
we
Luego,
required.
para lo que es el
And
seguimiento de los
for the
estudios,
follow-up of
también
the
se hicieron
studies,
algunas
we
adaptaciones
also
con criterios
changes
basados en riesgos. Se
with
pidieron informes más
risk-based
frecuentes en
criteria.
aquellos
We asked for
estudios
more
que
frequent
avisoráramos,
reports
digamos, algún
in
riesgo.
studies where we thought there could be
Y
some kind of
también
risk.
se implementó
And
el
we
procedimiento de
implemented
inspecciones
the
remotas, ¿sí? Que
remote
permitió
inspections
seguir
procedure where we were
fiscalizando,
able
sobre
to
todo en la
oversee,
etapa de
especially during
aislamiento,
the
¿sí? Que
isolation
tuvimos
stage.
un aislamiento muy prolongado
We
en
had a
Argentina.
prolonged isolation period
Eso,
in
bueno, nos
Argentina.
permitió de alguna
And
manera
in a
continuar
way,
con la
that
fiscalización
allowed
y
us
la
to
vigilancia
continue
de
to
los
oversee
estudios.
and supervise the studies.
En relación a
As
oportunidades de
for
mejora
the
o a
improvement
cuestiones que, bueno,
opportunities
me
or
parece que uno
aspects which
reflexionándolo
one
retrospectivamente y
looking
del
at it
aprendizaje, de las
retrospectively
lecciones aprendidas
and
de la
learning from what
pandemia,
we learned during the pandemic,
surgieron, por supuesto, algunas,
certain
algunas opiniones o cuestiones
opinions
como para
or issues
pensar
came
en
up so
mejoras.
that one could consider how to improve.
Por un lado, se hizo
First,
necesario y
the
bueno,
need,
lo hicimos efectivo,
and
la
we actually implemented
formalización de
this,
los
the
procesos de
need to
emergencia.
formalize the emergency
Incorporamos a la
processes, in
norma,
adding
nosotros hicimos un
to the
cambio normativo el
standard. We
año
did a
pasado, en el
standard
2025,
change
y en
last
ese
year in
cambio
2025,
incorporamos
during which we
ya
added
establecido por
the,
norma la
and this was
evaluación
established
prioritaria
by
y
the
expedita
priority and
para
sped up
estudios que sean,
evaluation
por
for
supuesto, para tratamiento, diagnóstico o
studies to
prevención
treat,
de alguna
diagnose, or prevent
patología dentro de lo que sea una crisis o
pathology
emergencia
during a
sanitaria.
crisis or a health
También,
emergency.
bueno, se establecieron
And also,
POEs
we
y
established these
eso,
operational
digamos,
procedures or
es
processes,
importante ya contar
and
con esto
it's
para estar
important to have this
preparados
to be
para una
prepared
futura
for
situación de crisis.
future crises.
Otro aspecto
Another
importante
important
que me parece
aspect,
remarcar es la
which I thought
transparencia que ya se
important to mention, was the
mencionó
transparency. This was
anteriormente.
also
Nosotros
mentioned by
durante la
others
pandemia
before. During the
publicábamos los
pandemic,
ensayos clínicos de
we
COVID,
published
también inspeccionamos
these
todos los
and
estudios de COVID
inspected
por
all the
una
COVID
cuestión también
studies
de
for
interés sanitario.
reasons
Pero
of health
volviendo al tema de
interest.
la
But coming back to the
transparencia, quizás se puede
transparency,
llegar a hacer una
maybe one could
publicación más ampliada, con información
publish
disponible más en tiempo real.
with more
Eso, por
details, with
supuesto, requiere
in
de
real time, which of
recursos,
course requires
de
more
pensar
and to maybe think of some kind of plan. But we do think it's important to make this comment at this time. Also, the strengthening of the coordination with the different authorities. Communication was fundamental during the COVID experience. We maximized communication with the sponsors, with the researchers. We also had exchange with the ethics committees, but we feel that all this has to be reinforced and reinforce communications with the different jurisdictional authorities to establish a more effective coordination, avoiding duplications in the evaluations, and also apply something which was also mentioned, which was the reliance with other health agencies. Though the COVID-19, there were agreements signed for exchange of information with the FDA and others. I also think that it's important to adopt it as a regular and formalized mechanism, maybe even more frequent, so that we can respond to these situations. And as my final thought, I think that the experience we learned during the pandemic showed our all regulatory capacities, ability to adapt in a rapid manner and efficient manner, responding to an emergency situation. But I think that retrospective analysis is important so that we can be prepared for future eventual health crises to identify improvement opportunities that could be related to what I mentioned before, like the formalization of emergency procedures, the in-depth digital transformation, risk-based management, strengthening transparency, and the consolidation of coordination and supervision mechanisms remotely, which would contribute to an even more efficient response in future emergencies. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Laura.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you very much for bringing up this aspect, which sometimes we forget, and that is that when the emergency begins, it doesn't mean that we have to forget all the other things that we're doing. So we have to find ways where we respond in an emergency way to the emergency, but we have to also not neglect all the things that are not emergencies. And our final panelist this afternoon is someone many of you, I'm sure, know well, Ricardo Palacios, an important researcher in our region who's been the key researcher in the Butantan Institute in one of the COVID-19 vaccine assays, who has a great deal of experience as a researcher, and PAHO has been working with him for years with him since the other emergency, Zika. So thank you, Ricardo, for being with us. It is a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Carla, y muchas gracias a la organización por
Thank you, Carla, and thank you to the organization for the invitation. First thing I'd like to do is to congratulate the organization and all the participants also, because they are understanding something significant, and it is that international public health emergencies, in particular those affecting our region, will continue to occur. This is not something in the past. That we know that COVID was something that was a huge experience, changing the lives of many people, us included. But what I also want to say is that we have had other emergencies, as Carla was mentioning, Zika, and different other emergencies. And we cannot limit ourselves to catastrophic events such as COVID-19. But there have been other events that maybe do not affect most of the population, but small segments of the population, as in the case of Zika, and also with mpox,
la primera cosa
but
que quiero
they
llamar
are
la
still
atención es que esto
emergencies,
va a ser
even
siempre.
if they are not
Tendremos
extended
emergencias
throughout.
de
So
diferentes
we will
magnitudes. No
always
todas van a
have
ser pandemias, no
emergencies
todas van a
of
ser,
different
porque
magnitudes.
esta
Not all
escala
of
es
them
muy
will be
pequeña, no
pandemics. Not all of
paralizan
them will be catastrophes that
países,
paralyze
prácticamente al mundo,
whole
pero
countries or even the whole
habrán
world. But
emergencias que
there will
merecen
be
también una atención
emergencies
y por
that
eso son
need to
declaradas
be
emergencias salud
taken care
pública
of,
y
and
que
they
estas
are
tenemos que tenerles
public
también con
health
igual
emergencies,
cuidado,
and they need to be
porque
taken
para
care
esas
of
personas que están
in the
en ese
same way,
riesgo
because for the people who are at
es una
risk,
urgencia tan grande como
it,
lo fue para
it
todos
is an
nosotros.
emergency. It is an
Entonces, ese
emergency
es
as
el primer
it
mensaje que
was
yo
with
quería
COVID-19.
traer
So
hoy.
that was my
Me encantó
first
que
message. I loved
nuestra colega
that
Ana
our
Laura mencionó la protección de los
colleague
participantes y
Laura
beneficios en casos
talked
de
about
emergencia.
the
Eso me parece
participation
fundamental. Y aquí yo
of
quiero llamar la
participants, which
atención
is
y
essential.
recordar,
And I want
ustedes
to
lo vieron,
remind you
es
all
historia
of
que se
this.
invierte en un libro,
This is
porque
part
es
of
la
history.
vivencia que
You've
la gente
probably
común
read
tiene
about
de
it.
vivir la
You
emergencia.
have the
Y es que
evidence. You
de
saw it in the
cuando se
news.
declara la emergencia,
When
cuando la emergencia llega
the
a nuestras
emergency
puertas,
is declared,
hay
when the
tiempo.
emergent
Esto no es,
when the emergency comes to our
pero
door,
rara vez
we
se
have
ocurre de
time.
forma inmediata. O sea,
Rarely
normalmente la mayor parte de nosotros no va a vivir como en el
do
primer
we
lugar
have
donde ocurren los casos en el epicentro. Claro, habrá alguno que
a
sí
situation where
ocurre,
we are
pero en la
located
mayor
right
parte de
at
los
the
casos esto
epicenter.
no es verdad.
Of course, it may
Nosotros
happen to
tenemos
some people,
tiempo,
but
entonces
in most
yo
of the
recuerdo
cases,
cuando
we
yo
still have
vi las
time
primeras
to
informaciones a
act.
finales
When
de
I saw the
2019
first information at the end
por
of
temas de alertas
2019 through alert systems
epidemiológicos que estaban
about
ocurriendo casos en la China, después
epidemiological
volví a escuchar de los
um,
casos que vienen a
outbreaks
Europa
in
en
China, and then
Italia
some cases
principalmente,
in
o
Italy,
comienzan a
mostly in
aparecer casos en
Italy,
otras partes
and
del mundo.
then we start seeing cases
Y
in
lo que
other
yo quiero
parts of the
decirles
world.
es,
What I want to
usen
tell you
ese tiempo.
is
O sea,
use that
cuando esto inicia
time
a ocurrir, ese tiempo toca
when
utilizarlo. O sea,
you hear
puede
about
ser
these
que
alerts,
eventualmente
you
no
can
llegue,
start
puede
using the
ser.
time.
Pero cuando
Perhaps
ustedes
the
sepan que esto
emergency
está
won't come
iniciando a
to you,
ocurrir,
but
hay que
when you
prepararse.
know that an
Entonces,
emergency is
prepararse
coming,
significa
you need to be prepared. And what does
aprender.
this mean? You need to
Generalmente son
learn.
enfermedades que son
These are
inusuales, no
usually
las
unusual
cosas que ya
diseases.
conocemos
These are
que
not things
ocurren de
that
forma
we
endémica
know
o de forma
that are endemic
epidémicos
or we
constantemente,
have
no son cosas
constant
totalmente
epidemic
nuevas, sino
outbreaks
que hay que
of them.
aprender.
No, these are
Y hay que
new
ver
things,
la literatura
novel
existente,
things.
ver
So we
analogías,
need to start
contactar
studying the
expertos que
literature.
pueden ayudarnos. Ese
We
es
try
más
to
o
look
menos
for
como
analogies, contact
cuando
experts.
en el avión a uno
So
le dicen,
it's just
antes
like in
de
the
ayudar a
airplane.
los otros con máscara,
We are
nos
told
dijeron,
when we are on an
colóquese su
airplane,
máscara. Es
uh,
básicamente eso. Uno mismo tiene que
put on your
quitarse para
mask
que a uno le
first
den su vaso
before
para
helping
después
others.
uno
So
poder
we
servir a los
need
otros
to
ese papel que
learn
acostumbran a uno estar
about it
haciendo
ourselves and
de
learn
situaciones,
thoroughly
sea con gente
before
ética,
we
sea
can
en
respond
ciencias
to a
regulatorias o sea
situation and before
ambientes.
we start
Entonces,
working with
realmente
the
utilizar ese
researchers
tiempo
or
de
the
forma
NRAs,
sabia, de
etc.
forma
So we need to learn to
consciente,
use
porque
that
si esto está
time
iniciando a
consciously
correr,
and
seguramente va
wisely,
a llegar a
because
nuestras
if
puertas.
we have
Si no llega, muy bien, pues aprendimos algo, pero
an
si
epidemic or
llega,
something that
iniciamos a
is moving,
conocer y a
it might
prepararnos
eventually come
y
to our
digamos,
door. So we
digamos
need
de
to be
forma destinada,
prepared,
de forma
and
desprevenida, pero por lo menos conseguimos
we
utilizar
cannot be
escenarios en los
caught
cuales
off
podemos
guard.
movernos, con quién
So
contar,
we
cómo
need to
apoyarnos,
have a
cómo
plan to know how we're going to
volver a
support
repasar
one another,
las guías
to
que
review the
se han ido preparado,
guidelines
como el tema
that
del
have been
OPS,
prepared.
volver a
For
hacer
example,
posiblemente
PAHO
entrenamientos
guides,
para que la gente
doing
refresque
training so
conocimiento
that
sobre
people
esto. Pues
have a refresher on
utilicemos
what
ese
to
tiempo.
do.
Yo me
And what
acuerdo que
the
en
thing is,
febrero,
I
cuando
remember in
estábamos en
February
COVID-19
of
y no había ningún
2020,
caso en Brasil,
where we had
estábamos
not
estudiando
one single
todo
case in
acerca del
Brazil, we
coronavirus
were
y
already
en ese
studying
tiempo estaba
everything
ese
about
fenómeno. O sea,
coronavirus
habíamos
that had been
estudiado MERS, habíamos
published to
estudiado
that point.
el
We
coronavirus
had
común de que se
studied the
llama COVID
common
19, pero
coronavirus, the common
prepararse
cold
significa
virus. We
absolutamente punto.
studied whatever was
Y es
available.
eso, hay
So
poco
this
tiempo,
is
entonces
essential. We need to study to
utilicemos,
prepare ourselves. If
utilicemos
we
ese
have a
día
little
porque realmente
lead
es
time, we
necesario.
have to use it.
La otra
And
cosa que
that is a
ocurre,
must. Another
esto,
thing that
esto es una
happens,
realidad, o sea,
and
no
this
lo
is
voy a
a
decir que es
reality,
una
and I'm
realidad
not going to
en nuestra
say it
región,
is a
porque
reality in our
nosotros somos
region,
países
because we
es
are
una realidad
developing
que ocurre
countries.
en
No,
todas
it
las
is
latitudes,
it
ocurre
is
en
a
todas las
reality
latitudes.
that occurs everywhere.
Las presiones,
There will be
cuando
pressures
uno inicia
of
a
all kinds
trabajar
when
en
we start working
asuntos que
on
afectan a una
issues
gran cantidad de
affecting a
población, que afectan la
large number of the
economía.
population, affecting the
Comienzan a haber
economy.
presiones también
We
para que ocurran determinadas
begin
cosas
to
en
have
cualquier
pressures
sentido,
for
o sea,
things to
para
happen in many
acelerar
ways.
cosas, como
For
ya lo
example, to
anunciaron ustedes,
accelerate
acelerar cosas que
things,
no deberían,
as my
no están
colleagues have
probadas
mentioned,
para que
things
sean
that, for example,
implementables
using things
por
that have never
pacientes,
been used
instituciones en ese
before,
sentido,
and there's
para
a lot of
saltarse
pressure. Oh, let's
pasos
use
que
this
pueden
this
afectar la
protocol
integridad
here and there,
ética de los
and
estudios,
let's
en
skip
fin, hay una
steps,
serie de presiones que
which
pueden ocurrir. Otras
can
presiones
lead
importan.
to poor data
Desafortunadamente en
and poor
Brasil hemos
results.
tenido una
Unfortunately, in
posición
Brazil, we
del,
had
del entonces presidente
a
que fue contra
situation
los estudios de
with
la vacuna
the
y tiene
then president who was
estudios
against the
que él se
vaccine. And
muera de presión
so
en
there
unos
are
que
innumerable
siempre
pressures that
recordamos
we
con
have
severidad tanto
to
él como
face, and we
científica
need
para
to
poder
remember our
entregar, porque
scientific and
realmente
ethical
si no
integrity.
resistimos estas
Because
presiones,
if we do not
no vamos a
resist
poder
these
entregar
pressures, we
la
won't be
solución
able
a la
to
población. A veces
provide a
la respuesta
solution
es un
to the
no. Y este
population.
también yo quiero
Sometimes the answer
decirlo,
is
no
no,
todos los ensayos
and
clínicos van a
not
ocurrir
all
de esta
clinical
forma
trials
totalmente. La
will
respuesta
end
es no.
successfully, and
Pero tener un
sometimes the
no
answer is
honesto,
no.
llegar y no
But
decir, por
let
ejemplo, y
the
fue bien citado el
answer,
ejemplo del
whether
plasma,
yes or no, to
decir
be
de forma
honest.
honesta,
For
mire,
example, the
esta
use of
intervención
that
no
plasma,
sirve,
we
hay
should
que
be honest and say, no, this
parar con
intervention
esa
doesn't
intervención
work,
y
and we need to
ocuparnos,
stop it
buscar
right
otras,
now, and let us
cómo
look
utilizar
elsewhere
recursos que en ese
and
momento son
use
muy limitados,
resources,
pocos
which
y
at
los
that
recursos
point
para
are
ir a
very
buscar
limited. How can
intervenciones
we
que
use
sean más
our
útiles.
resources
Esta es una
looking
respuesta
for
muy valiosa también. Entonces,
responses that
al
are more
término,
useful? And
lo
this is very
podemos
valuable.
encontrar de forma
If we
honesta, de
can
forma
give a
íntegra.
no
Es
response
una
in an
respuesta
honest
muy
and
valiosa y en
integral
eso,
way, then this
en
is
la
very
política, creo, de
valuable
autoridades regulatorias como autoridades
to
éticas para
support
acompañar ese
ethics
proceso
authorities
de
and
integridad científica y
uh,
ética. Es
regulatory
supremamente
authorities.
valioso.
And
Entonces,
this is a very
quiero
valuable
resaltar esto y
support
nosotros desde el
that
punto de vista
we
de
can
investigadores
give as
entendemos que
researchers.
ese es un
We
apoyo que
understand that
tenemos
this
para
is the
poder
support we
mantener
can
y
provide
resistir
in order to maintain
presiones
and
por
resist
supuesto. Entonces,
pressures that
esto
may
también
come our
imagino
way.
que desde la
And
presión
I
de las instancias de
imagine
autoridad
that
regulatoria, las
there are pressure
públicas,
also
inclusive a
on
niveles de
NRAs and
también esto
also
es un
ethics
llamado a
committees. And so
tener
this is an
fuerza,
appeal
apoyarse unos a
to
otros en
the
esa
strength in
causa
supporting one
común de
another
poder
in the
encontrar
common cause that
la
will allow
verdad
us to
mediante la
find the
mejor
truth
metodología científica
using
y
scientific
respetando los principios.
methodologies and
Esto
respecting
también tengo que reconocerlo.
our
Eh,
tenets.
Ahí en nuestra
Eh,
geografía en América
in
Latina
Latin
tenemos
America,
una
we
diversidad de
have
países, en las Américas en
many different
general. No
countries.
todos
In the
los países
Americas in
seguramente
general,
van a ser parte
not
de
all
los
countries will be
pioneros,
part
en
of
fin.
pioneering
Pero mi llamado
studies
también es
and
iniciar a
trials.
pensar, y esto
But
lo digo también por
uh,
experiencia
I'm
que tuvimos en
making an
Brasil,
appeal
es iniciar a
here
pensar
based on an
también
experience we had
otras
in
formas de
Brazil.
estudiar y de
There are
generar
other ways in
evidencia.
studying and
Esto incluye la
generating
medición de
evidence. We
efectividad,
have
que también fueron muy
implementation and
valiosos a la hora de
effectiveness studies, which
implementar
are very valuable and were
por
very
ejemplo,
valuable.
vacunas.
For example, when we're
Y
trying to
esto
implement
es una
a
experiencia
vaccine,
muy feliz de
and
30
we've
años trabajar
had
en ese sentido. Y actualizo que
several
también
successful
es necesidad
experiences
que
there. We
generan
can
otro
do
tipo de
other kinds of
evidencia, pero que
studies, generating other
sustentan
kinds of evidence, but
los
also
estudios de eficacia
supporting
clínica de
uh,
fase uno 2 3 entonces estamos hablando de estudios en
clinical
fase
evidence
4
of
y que también
phase
ayudan a
1,
generar
2, and
evidencia
3, and even
científica
4,
que
and they
guían
help
los programas de
generate
salud pública a
scientific
cómo
evidence
implementar
guiding
mejor las medidas
public
que
system
eventualmente estén a
programs that
disposición.
allow them to better implement
Recuerdo
whatever
dos
is
en
available.
el
I
cual
remember
pues
two in
logramos hacer
particular.
un
One where we
estudio
were able
randomizado
to do a randomized
clústeres, por
study by
conglomerados,
clusters,
en una
and
ciudad
this was
en Sao
done
Paulo, en una pequeña
in
ciudad,
the
y con
state
esto
of
pues
Sao Paulo,
pudimos
in a
generar
small
evidencia
city,
muy
and we were
valiosa
able
para
to
poder generar
generate very
confianza frente a
valuable
la eficacia de la vacuna. Y hay otro
evidence
que será
in
publicado
support
en
of a
breve,
vaccine, and
pues lo que se
another
hizo es un estudio para
study
poder
was a
hacer un
study
labeling para
to
determinar
determine the effect of prioritizing certain risk groups compared to those who didn't have the same risk. So there are other opportunities, and I want to incentivize the groups in different countries that may feel that they cannot necessarily lead clinical trials. There are other studies and trials that can be implemented during an emergency to generate trust in the population and find the best way of incorporating technology. So that's something else I wanted to mention. And finally, in the preparation phase, not talking about the past, but looking toward the future, the next emergencies, we will see them within the context of a tool that is changing the way in which we do many things, even including artificial intelligence, AI. So my last appeal to you is learn about it. There is no other way. There's no way out, because the next emergency we will have a component of AI. And what is particularly important regarding ethics, that we require consensus, reflection, and internalizing the knowledge. And there will be a lot of pressure. People, everybody are going to feel that they are experts because they're using different AI tools, and people think they are experts, but that's not the case. They may have done some superficial research through AI. So please prepare yourselves, learn about these tools. If you know these tools and you're able to use them critically, they will be useful. These tools are useful, but if you don't use them adequately, they can lead you to one of the greatest problems we had with Zika, which is an infodemic. It's an information epidemic. Different quality of information. It was very hard to tell what was true, what was false, what was good, what was bad. So the risk is that infodemics are a problem, and they were a problem at the beginning of Zika. There was a lot of disinformation, and many people were giving opinions right and left with something that they had never seen before. And within a week, we had thousands of experts. Thanks to AI, they can just type in a line on the program, and they think they have become experts. But please prepare yourselves. This is something I want to share with you, and especially with you, because I know you want to do the right thing, because it's not a matter of if, but when we will have the next pandemic. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ricardo. And let me reiterate the commitment by our participants, by the national authorities, the ethics committees, the experts from the region to participate in this reflection, especially during the World Cup. Yes, I think this is something we have not mentioned when we were planning. And of course, we know that this is a time where people are interested in watching their games. And I think the having so many participants here shows that all the people are so interested and willing to do research during times of emergency. A brief comment related to what Ricardo said regarding AI. It is a challenge, of course. We hope it brings also some new solutions, but as you will or might remember, we also had a seminar for learning how to use AI tools for ethical reviews. And you might also remember that during the launch presentation, For the clinical trial accelerator, there was a presentation about some resources that we are designing at PAHO, which are almost ready and will facilitate our identification of who works on what to solve the problem mentioned by Ricardo, and so that we can add efforts and collaborate as quickly as possible during an emergency. Now, I will invite Sara Carracedo from the Bioethics Regional Program to be the moderator. And I invite you to ask your questions using the Q&A. And now we will Patricia and I will try to answer your questions, and the moderator will be Sara. Thank you, Patricia, for your presentation, as well as thanks to all the panelists. They reflect all the work that has happened during the pandemic and how we have made them into lessons and incorporate into our protocols for future emergencies. A question which is something that people are asking themselves. Yeah, so we can accelerate, yes. So, but how can we strike a balance? So the pace in starting research and doing research and the need to be reflective, and how we balance ethics during an emergency. Yes, Patricia, over to you. Okay. From the standpoint of the regulatory framework, first, we should train ourselves, prepare ourselves, educate ourselves. Secondly, establishing standards and norms for regarding procedures before the emergency hits. Having this done will allow us to accelerate processes, discuss lessons learned using new mechanisms. We heard the panelists mention some. Laura shared some of the ones they use, which allowed them to accelerate and have norms and standards in place. Also discussing how we can pre-approve master protocols, also have visits with producers, manufacturers, and remote inspections, etc. And the basic thing also is for us to start working on two different aspects. One is the reliance or the using decisions from other health authorities. We need to stop mistrusting or distrusting and start trusting the work of others, because others may have already done the work. And so there's no need for us to reinvent the wheel. So both with countries in the region and outside the region, this will allow us to accelerate mechanisms. And so I think this is a very important issue to work on. So I think that's, oh no, but I would like to add the importance of joint work. These tools that are being created by PAHO will allow us to have something we didn't have during COVID, because these were part of the lessons learned. In other words, to be able to work regionally together, knowing who's doing what, where, and using the capacities of others. If, for example, in the area of preclinical studies, someone is farther ahead, or in the issues of safety or procedures, all of these things, if they can be shared, then this will be great, and we will be able to work more cooperatively. we have the regulators of clinical trials. We are going to start with two harmonized documents so that no one needs to reinvent the wheel. And there are other documents from other authorities who have learned and have been able to solve problems. And they have recently published documents, one from the European Agency on Medication. So it will be important to see what the different agencies have done. And this will allow us to work with harmonized documents so that we have standards and norms that are applicable and regulations that are common to everyone. It's so that we can all use the same parameters.
Patricia. Yo quiero
Thank you, Patricia.
ahondar sobre
I
un
also
aspecto
wanted
que
to
mencionó de hecho Laura, y es que en una
mention
emergencia
something
buscamos
that
agilizar los
Laura
procesos.
talked about,
Buscamos hacer
and I want to go
las cosas
deeper
de una manera
there.
distinta. Pero
Sometimes
no
we try
estamos
to do things
cambiando esos
differently,
estándares
but
éticos.
it's
No
not that we're
estamos diciendo, ya no
changing
nos
ethical
importan las
standards.
pautas
It's
del
not that
CIEM,
we're
ya no nos
saying,
importan
oh, we don't care
las buenas
about
prácticas
such and
clínicas.
such
Estamos viendo cómo
standards
ponerlas en práctica
or
de
good
una
clinical
manera
practices, but we're
ágil,
looking to
acorde a las
become more
necesidades.
streamlined
Entonces, la
according
validez
to the needs.
científica
So
sigue
scientific
siendo un
validity
criterio ético
continues to be
fundamental, sigue
a
siendo
basic
indispensable que un estudio tenga
ethical
validez científica a
basis. It's
fin de
important for
poder ser aprobado como
clinical
comité
trials
de ética
to
en
have
investigación.
scientific basis
Ahora
so
bien,
that they can be approved by
a pesar de ese consenso, y
those who
porque
grant
hubo
approval. So
claridad sobre esto en
despite
nuestra
of that
región, a la hora que
consensus,
todos los comités de toda la
and
región tratábamos de ir
so when
empujando,
all of us in the
contribuyendo y siendo
region
flexibles,
try to push and be
creo que
flexible,
fuimos,
I
y
think,
hablo a nivel
and
de
I am
regional, creo que
talking at
fuimos un
regional
poco
level.
laxos con
I
este
think we
tema.
were a little
Nosotros
lax
en la
on this
OMS
point.
hicimos
At
una
PAHO, we
revisión
did
sobre todos los
a
ensayos
review
clínicos
of
que se
all
hicieron en los
clinical
primeros
trials
6
that were
meses
done
de la
during
pandemia
the
de la
first 6
COVID-19.
months
¿Por qué
of
hicimos eso?
COVID
Porque con
pandemic.
frecuencia se
Why did we
decía
do it?
que
Because
solamente la
often we heard
investigación se estaba
that
haciendo en
research was
países de
being
altos
done
recursos.
only
Pues nosotros
in
veíamos
high
un gran
income
volumen de
countries.
investigación en
And we
países
generated
de
a
medianos a
large
bajos
volume
recursos.
of
Después lo hemos
research
visibilizado.
in medium
Lo
and
aprendimos
low
muchísimo en el
income
proceso.
countries.
Vimos que
So we wanted
muchos
to
ensayos
make this
chiquitos,
visible. We
repetitivos.
saw that
Entonces,
many
todas esas iniciativas
small
que se han
studies were repetitive, and
mencionado
all those
de
initiatives that have been
a
mentioned here
aumentar la transparencia en la
about
investigación, de
increasing
saber qué se hace, qué
transparency
está
for
haciendo otro
research, to
para
know
sumar esfuerzos,
what
son
different people are
centrales
doing.
para
All of
asegurar
this
que la
allow us
investigación
to
que
add up
haga
all the
nuestra
efforts
región no
so
tenga
that
un
all
grado
the research that
mínimo
we do
de
in our
validez
region
científica, sino que efectivamente
has
sea investigación sólida que
effectively
pueda contribuir a
sound,
encontrar
solid
soluciones
research that can
de salud y
help
tener
find
protocolos listos de
health
antemano, tener
solutions.
protocolos
And to
preaprobados,
have
va a ser más
pre-approved
fácil
protocols
que en
will
una
make it
emergencia
easier that during an
podamos hacer
emergency, we
investigación
will be
con
able
los estándares
to
científicos
do research
más altos que
using the
existen.
highest possible
Gracias,
scientific
Carla,
standards.
gracias,
Thank you,
Patricia.
Carla. Thank you,
Hay
Patricia.
una pregunta
Now we have a question here
que creo que atrás tiene esta
that
diferencia entre la supervisión ética y la supervisión
makes a difference
regulatoria de la
between ethical
investigación.
and
La pregunta en
regulatory
concreto nos dice, ¿por qué no una ARN le dice al paciente qué es
oversight.
lo que tiene que hacer y así todos, digamos, nos
So,
ponemos en orden?
can't
Y si
we
bien
all know what
Patricia hace
to
un rato
do?
mencionaba ese trabajo conjunto
Patricia
que se debe hacer,
mentioned
la idea
joint
es de
work,
que
and it's
trabajamos
important.
juntos,
The idea
pero
is
no
that, yes, we
revueltos, de
work
los comités de ética
together, but we are not mixed in
los,
because
las
ethics
autoridades, las
and
ARNs. Entonces,
regulations or
yo tal vez
the
quisiera
RNAs
preguntarles
have
por
their
qué es
own specific
necesario
role.
que
So
ambos
I want
frentes
to ask them
hagan su
why we
parte,
need for
pero a la vez
both
trabajen juntos en
fronts
preparación en las
to do their own
emergencias.
work, but also learn how to collaborate and share and work
Patricia, ¿quieres
together during
arrancar
an
tú?
emergency.
Como quieras.
Patricia, would you like to start or?
Estás
Oh,
con el
you're
micro apagado.
muted. You're muted.
No decía que empiece.
Yes, thank you.
Ok.
Well, no, I
La
was actually
supervisión
asking
ética
you to start.
que hacen los
So,
comités de ética y la
uh,
investigación con la
ethical
debida
supervision and oversight
supervisión de la
by ethics
autoridad
committees
nacional
with the
es
supervision
distinta
of the
de la
national authority
supervisión
is different from
regulatoria,
the
también llamado
regulatory
fiscalización,
um,
que hace la autoridad
oversight
regulatoria
done
nacional
by
para un
the
subconjunto de
NRA
los
for
ensayos
a
clínicos,
subset
es
of
aquellos que van a
clinical
obtener la
trials. In other
aprobación,
words, those that will
que buscan la aprobación
obtain
de un nuevo
or
producto o
that are
dispositivo.
seeking
Ven,
approval for a new
vemos cosas
medicine or
distintas.
a
En un
new
comité de
device.
ética vemos si las
We
investigaciones
see
son éticas.
that in a
En
committee, in an
supervisión
ethics committee,
regulatoria, la autoridad
issues are
regulatoria
ethical.
pues
In the
tiene
NRA,
tareas relacionadas para distintas
that
que se
authority
ahondará más.
has
Y el punto
different
es efectivamente que es como siempre digo, es como una lasaña de
reviews.
capas
It's like
y
a
cada capa
lasagna where
tiene que
we
ser
have
de una
layers.
manera
Each
acorde.
layer
Entonces,
has to match
cada
the other
comité,
layers.
hay muchas
So
maneras en que los comités de ética pueden
there are many
funcionar
ways in
bien.
which ethics
No hay
committees
una
can work
única manera de
well.
funcionar
There's
bien.
not one single way to
Hay
work
distintas
well.
maneras de
There are
funcionar bien.
different ways to work
Y
well.
nosotros tenemos
And we
una
have
herramienta para la
a
acreditación de los comités de
tool
ética
to
que son sobre las distintas
for
maneras de
accreditation
funcionar bien que puede
of
tener un
ethics
comité
committees, and
de
it
ética y de
describes all the ways
investigación.
in
Y
which
tenemos también un
an
buen
ethics
modelo
committee for
para
research should work.
emergencias que todos los comités
And
pueden tomar y
and
ajustar
all committees
teniendo en
can
cuenta la
take
estrategia
these
nacional para la
guidelines
revisión
and they
ética,
can
teniendo
adapt
en
it
cuenta
based on the
cómo se organizan bien,
NRA
porque nuevamente
standards.
no es un procedimiento, no
It's
es una cosa
not
idéntica en todos los casos.
identical
Hay
for all
maneras de hacer las
cases, of
cosas
course.
mal,
There
pero hay
are
un par de maneras
different
distintas de
ways
hacerlas bien. Y
of doing things wrong,
POEs
but
para
there's
la revisión
also a
ética
couple of ways
en
of doing
emergencias
things right.
están a
And
disposición,
this, for emergencies,
pero es para la parte de la
these
supervisión
guidelines
ética.
are
Y ahora con
available
eso le
for
paso la
ethical
palabra a Patricia para que complemente
oversight.
los
But
aspectos de
let
la
me
supervisión
now
regulatoria.
send it over to you, Patricia.
Con respecto a la
All right,
supervisión
so regarding
regulatoria, el foco
regulatory
de la
oversight,
agencia regulatoria
the
es que
focus of the
tiene
NRA
misión de
is that
aprobar
their mission is to
productos
approve
o,
products or
digamos, nuevos o
new
modificaciones de productos que ya
products
aprobó
or
que
modifications
sean
for products
eficaces,
that have
seguros
already
y
been
de
approved
calidad.
so that they
En este
be
sentido, entonces,
effective,
los
safe,
ensayos
and
clínicos que
high
van a dar
quality.
lugar
So,
a esa
based on
posterior
that, the
decisión
clinical
regulatoria
trials
en las
that will
distintas
lead
fases
to
de
that
desarrollo
regulatory decision,
del
then
producto,
they have
desde las
different
etapas no
phases
clínicas y
from
las
the
etapas clínicas.
non-clinical stages
Entonces,
going
la
through the
autoridad
clinical
regulatoria
stages.
tiene
So the
ese foco,
NRA
que
has
no quiere
that
decir
focus.
que
It doesn't
no se
mean that
complemente en un
eh,
sistema
they
general que
do not
hay un
that
sistema
they're not
regulatorio general
complementary.
que cuenta con comités
Of
de
course, there is
supervisores que hacen la
a
revisión
general
ética y
regulatory
en estos
framework
estudios para
with
la
that
aprobación de un
includes
nuevo
ethical
producto o
review, but
modificación de un
when you
registro
need
ya
to approve
existente,
a new
además
product
con
or
la
to modify
autorización
one that
regulatoria.
already exists,
Pero entonces la autoridad
they have to
regulatoria,
go
aunque va a
through all
querer
the
saber que
regulatory
esos
issues, but
estudios
the NRI
pueden dar
needs to
lugar a
make
la
sure that
aprobación de
those
ese
studies
producto y que los
can lead
datos
to
que
the approval
surgen
of
de
that
esos
product, and
estudios
the
son
data coming
datos
out
en
of
los que
those
se
studies
puede basar la
are
decisión
data
regulatoria.
that
Imagínense
will
ustedes
serve
que
as the
fueran
basis
datos
for a regulatory
que, voy a
decision.
poner dos
So
situaciones, que fueran
why?
datos que no
So what would
existen o
happen
datos que
if
fueron
the data
creados y se
did
están
not
tomando una
exist, or if
decisión
they
regulatoria
were
con eso?
created,
O
and
imagínense que
you
sea un estudio de baja
create
calidad
a
y se está
regulatory
tomando una
situation, or
decisión
if the
regulatoria de aprobar un
it is,
producto
or if it
con
was
datos de
a low
baja calidad.
quality trial
Entonces,
and
en
it
ese
yielded low
sentido,
quality
esto
data
es lo que
and
tienen
the
que ver las
results are
agencias
bad. So
regulatorias. Y
this
en
is where the
en las
regulatory
emergencias de salud pública tienen que
agencies
garantizar lo mismo.
have to
Y para
work. And for
garantizar lo
emergencies,
mismo,
it's the same thing, to guarantee the
teniéndolo que
same thing,
hacer en situaciones
having
tan
to do it
cambiantes y
in
en tan poco
changing
tiempo,
environments, and
tienen que
within a
tener
short period of
procedimientos y
time,
normas que
they
les
need to have
permitan
procedures
hacerlo
and norms
sin que
that
se
allow
ponga en
them to do it
juego la
without
seguridad y la calidad.
jeopardizing
En
the
algunos
safety
países de
and
la
quality.
región
in some countries of the region, there is still some confusion to know that, in the sense that ethics committees and NRAs are the same thing, but they're not the same. Of course, both are needed. The ethics committee cannot replace the NRA, and vice versa. The NRA cannot replace the ethics committee. And also, the regulatory agency cannot tell them what procedures to use. Each ethics committee has to have their own standards, and the NRAs have to create their own standards and norms. Yes, there needs to be communication, and they should have procedures to communicate between them, and there needs to be a work that is, of course, together for the common good, but they're not mixed in. They're not, because they couldn't do their work. And we need to understand this. If one tries to do the work of the other because the other thinks the other cannot do the work, then nothing is achieved. And this is something that we need to do in our region.
Muchísimas gracias, Patricia.
Thank you
Creo
so much,
que, como
Patricia.
estamos
And
con
I
la hora
believe that
cierro
because
ya
of the
la
time
sesión,
issue, I'm going to end the session
el
here.
punto que has resaltado es
And what you
fundamental.
just brought up is fundamental.
Zapatero a tu zapato,
Each
juntos
to his
pero no
own,
revueltos,
together but not
colaborando,
mixed,
pero sin dejar
cooperating
nuestras
but
tareas de
without
fondo. Muchísimas
forgetting our
gracias por
own
su
activities. Thank you
participación.
so much for
Los
your participation.
invitamos a,
And we invite you
van a
to,
recibir, si
well,
son parte de nuestra
if you're
lista
part of
ética,
our
de
list
ética de
of
investigación, van a recibir
research
la
ethics, you
grabación
will be
y
receiving
los
this
invitamos
recording.
a ver
And
la
we invite you
grabación
to
también en el
see
portal de
the
ensayos
recording
clínicos de la
in the
OPS
clinical assay
y en el
portal
sitio
of
web
PAHO,
de
as well as
Bioethics.
in the
Muchísimas
Bioethics
gracias y una
website.
excelente
Thank you
tarde.
very much and have a great end of your afternoon.